Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Redemption in a Worthy World in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 21, A Friendly Match. Sasuke arrived at the training ground 2 hours before the Hokage had asked him to and spent the time combing over his arsenal of skills. He'd expanded his jutsu library considerably over the years, thanks to the regular old Sharingan. However, remembering which ones he had in the heat of battle was difficult for any experienced Uchiha, so most tended to rely on a core of ninjutsu drilled into them by the clan. Kakashi would, of course, be expecting them. After half an hour of scribbling in the dirt with a stick and reviewing jutsu to counter Kakashi's numerous changes in chakra nature, he realized he was actually looking forward to this fight. It wasn't a desperate battle to save the world, to start a revolution, or to seal away a god, just a public spar for the ninja of the village to examine his abilities and show off that there were still surviving Uchiha. He could win or lose as he wished, and all it would change was the numbers on a mission payment stub. Refreshing. Reinvigorated, Sasuke spent the next hour and a half running through the esoteric abilities his remaining Mangekyou Sharingan granted him, as well as his repertoire of lightning jutsu, and stretching his muscles. Countering lightning with lightning wasn't the most efficient use of chakra, but it was impressive and flashy, which the civilians and jonin alike could appreciate on an aesthetic level, if nothing else. Still, he couldn't afford to play too many of his cards, even with Kabuto gone from the village. There were always other spies for Danzo, Orochimaru, and perhaps even Sasori of the Akatsuki. Who knows, perhaps Zetsu itself would show up again, the black spawn gleeful at another Uchiha to corrupt with the curse of hatred. Not that it would work, but Sasuke had no way to seal the creature. Okay, now he was just drifting into possibility instead of the immediate probability Kakashi would hand him his ass. Indra looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw what had to have been half the Jonin lounge ambling towards him, with Kakashi's silver hair in front, on time. Sasuke couldn't help it, his mouth dropped open. Kakashi was on time. His bastard of a sensei had even been late to his own coronation as Hokage, but now he'd shown up right when Sarutobi had recommended they arrive. His arrival really was changing things already, for a fundamental anchor of the universe to have shifted so suddenly. Nara were lazy geniuses, Hyuga were condescending, and Kakashi Hatake was late. But not this time. Sasuke scrambled to his feet and chanted the familiar Yamanaka incantation in his mind, settling into the patterns of Indra Uchiha, who was already beginning to feel like slipping into a well-worn pair of trousers. Indra looked up and allowed a small smirk to cross his face as he waved his hand in greeting. For an Uchiha, that was a very hearty welcome, and Kakashi, long fluent in Uchihese, waved in acknowledgement and his eye crinkled into a friendly smile. Indra spoke first. So, you've brought along the peanut gallery? As long as they stay out of the line of fire, they're welcome to the show. Believe me, commented Kurane, who was practically vibrating with excitement as she produced a thick pair of reading glasses, we wouldn't miss this for the world. She leafed through a legal pad covered in numbers and hatch marks. The mysterious Uchiha survivor in his first public appearance, up against his own clan's dojutsu by way of copy ninja Kakashi? Ibikis put a month's salary on you to win in the first minute. There was an audible groan from the assembled jonin. No fair, Kurane, you can't tell him the parameters. Now he's going to drag it out. Mama, wasn't this supposed to be a friendly spar, said Kakashi, hands in his pockets, looking as if he were out for a morning stroll. I think I'm going to have performance anxiety, with all this pressure. Indra pointed with his remaining hand. Then you probably shouldn't look behind you. If the jonin who had followed Kakashi to training ground 44 were a respectable group size, the horde charging from the tree line had to have been half the hidden village, already excited and chatting animatedly to each other. Indra flicked on the Sharingan just to capture the look of horror on Kakashi's face as they descended upon the contestants and swept over and around them in a wave of humanity. He saw Sakura hoisting an enormous cork board up while Kiba and Yazuka and Koji Akimichi scribbled down bets and stashed offered money into a cash register that seemed to have no bottom. A crowd of genin erected metal bleachers alongside the tree line while a harried-looking Hayate gecko sketched out a circle in the dirt. Civilians unfolded lawn chairs or umbrellas, though the sun wasn't anywhere near oppressive. He caught a glimpse of Sasuke forcibly dragging Naruto away from Teuichi's portable Ichiraku's stand, despite the fact it was 10 a.m., nowhere near lunchtime. He saw an Umbu mask for the briefest instant and the crowd parted to reveal the third Hokage, in full regalia and wearing his most grandfatherly smile. The advisors behind him even looked a little more human, clearly infected by the excitement and good cheer of the shinobi and civilians alike. Danzo walked with a little more energy to his step and his eye passed over both Indra and Kakashi, appraising them. Despite himself, a muscle in Indra's jaw twitched, but he took a deep breath as the Hokage raised his hands for silence. The chatter of conversation, the calls for bets intensified as the populace rushed to finish last-minute preparations before the Hokage could speak. With surprising speed the crowd melted back beyond the boundaries of the circle, Guy giving Kakashi an encouraging thumbs up and a grin, while Inoichi looked at Indra and flicked a brief string of Umbu sign. It wasn't complicated, an informal but well-memorized grouping every Umbu had issued and received at one time or another. It meant simply, kick his ass. Sarutobi raised his hands, in benediction as much as to quiet the crowd. Well then, now that everyone's looking forward to this contest, let me remind you of the rules. This was supposed to be a simple, private test of Uchiha-san's skills and to confirm his recovery after his sudden return to our fair village. He will become a Konoha shinobi, wearing the same headband and protecting the same village as every one of you. This fight will be judged by the clan heads, the counselors, and myself in a spirit of good faith. Sarutobi paused, ostensibly to take a breath, but he could have sworn he saw Counselor Homura step on Danzo's foot and mutter something about, "He's talking to you, Danzo." The bandaged elder sniffed and gestured as a trio of Umbu emerged from the crowd with 4 very comfortable-looking chairs, which the elders sank into with relieved sighs. Indra tuned back into the Hokage's speech. A contest of wits, ninjutsu, and physical ability that I hope will inspire all our young shinobi in training and encourage those who already wear their headbands proudly. The fight will allow all standard shinobi weapons and will continue until one opponent yields or the judges, including Hayate here, decides the match has run its course. The audience will, of course, be protected. He and Genma crouched at the edges of the circle and made a series of signs as a light blue barrier flared into existence before becoming as clear as glass. But we shall still get to enjoy the fruits of our shinobi's contest. Indra raised one eyebrow in surprise. A third-level training barrier put in place by the Hokage in a top jonin. He could work with something that strong. The Hokage turned to Indra and Kakashi, who had barely moved as the entire scene swept around them. Kakashi still standing with one hand in his pocket, as cool as if he had been lounging around on a street corner. Indra swept one foot through his meaningless scribbles in the dirt and unclipped his cloak, throwing it up to catch the breeze and carrying it up over the barrier to be chased by an unsettlingly large number of young and middle-aged women. Some of his mixed discomfort and excitement must have showed in his face even as the audience cheered at the dramatics, for Kakashi raised his one visible eyebrow and wrinkled his forehead, which was standard Uchihi's for, "Are you feeling all right?" Indra shrugged, cracked his neck, and laid one hand casually over the hilt of his sword, the Uchihi's response of "Bring it." Despite himself, he could not stop a smile from tugging at the corners of his lips. This was going to be fun. The Hokage had finally finished speaking and Hayate Gecko stepped forward. "All right, gentlemen, I want a good clean fight, no thumbs in the eye or barroom tricks. The ladies are watching." The combatants both nodded and stepped closer, each 2 or 3 feet from Hayate, their focus now entirely on each other. Kakashi looked serious, but Sasuke had been around the man long enough to see that twinkle in his eye. Despite all the gloom the man seemed to wallow in, he was just as excited as Indra was. Hayate brought down his hand, "Begin," and they were off. Kakashi pulled his headband up and launched forward with a kunao in each hand. Indra drew his own sword and they met in the middle of the field in a blaze of sparks and twisting limbs. Kakashi had 2 blades, but a shorter reach, while Indra's longer blade spun in his hands as he shifted from a standard and backhand grip on the weapon from moment to moment. A vertical rear guard along his shoulder blade to block a horizontal blow a genin could have seen coming, only to spin and turn himself nearly horizontal in a leap that forced Kakashi to abort his follow-up strike to block the sword whistling around Indra's hips with the full centripetal force of the man's body behind it. The kunao and the blade locked in a classic X pattern above Kakashi's head, the jonin bracing against the blow even as Indra used the leverage of his position to vault himself up into the air using enough chakra to send him spiraling up, still horizontal. Kakashi looked up at him to see Indra use the last of his momentum to kick the sword back down and was forced to backflip out of the way. The crowd owed, appreciatively as Indra's lone hand flashed through the signs and a rain of phoenix flower followed the sword down as well. Kakashi's own hands had been signing and suddenly every stray puddle and bead of dew in the arena flew up and combined into a water wall, filling the whole area with steam as the jutsu collided. Kakashi and Indra could see through the regular steam just fine, but the copy ninja breathed out a thin stream of mist from behind his mask and the area soon became blanketed in a white, chakra-infused fog. The audience groaned at the loss of vision, then gasped as a dozen shuriken flew up, still trailing smoke, to embed themselves in Indra's chest. A chest which burst with a puff of smoke to reveal a perforated log in a classic substitution jutsu. There was a pause as the log fell to earth with a soft clonk followed by twin explosions of rock and flame that dissipated the mist as they collided once more. The audience saw Indra crouched low, flame still curling away from his lips as the grand fireball dissipated, while Kakashi was crouched equally low to the ground surrounded by broken ground and boulders. Both shinobi were surrounded by kunao and shuriken embedded in the dirt that had flown invisibly over each other's heads. Indra was pleased. His body was responding well, his chakra levels at satisfactory levels, and Kakashi was matching step with him, both gradually amping up the intensity of the fight. This was why Hatake had the makings of a good teacher, deep down. His adaptability and strategic mind naturally allowed the teacher to adjust his methods to his students or, in this case, his secret ex-student and current sparring partner. Indra straightened and tugged his sword out of the soil, spinning it in an unnecessary flourish before sliding it back into its sheath. "How do you feel about trying something unorthodox?" he called across to Kakashi, who straightened and leaned backwards, rotating his shoulder joints with an exaggerated casualness. They were both posturing now, two shinobi who were still getting the measure of their opponent and peacocking for the spectators while they strategized. Sasuke had shown only the standard Uchiha Jutsu in addition to his own unique Kenjutsu style, the result of not only traveling the elemental nations for a decade but a grueling 6-month training regimen from Killer Bee and Cloud. Freshly missing an arm, Sasuke had needed to rebuild his fighting style from scratch, and who better to ask than the master of unconventional Kenjutsu who wielded 8 blades plus a legendary one? The man had laid him out flat multiple times when Sasuke had tried to kidnap him, and he had been keenly aware his friends were the only reason he'd survived that fight. So he'd asked B to train him. To the man's credit, B had only beaten him bloody twice and had always treated him with respect afterwards. What he was planning to do now, however, was to go right back to the basics. He formed the hand signs slowly. Even though he'd performed the jutsu so many times, he only needed one to concentrate the chakra in his hand. He let the lightning chakra build in his hand until it became a physical thing, flickering out and snapping residual charge in the air, that sound as familiar as a lullaby. The chirping of the Chidori. Kakashi's eyes widened and he charged his own Reikari. How did you learn that jutsu?" His tone wasn't disbelief, but naked shock. Indra winked at him, and cast his voice to the crowd. "What a surprise, the copy ninja doesn't like to be copied. Let's see if the original holds up to the imitation." To the civilians he seemed to disappear, but the eyes of the Jonin and the Hokage followed him across the field, holding the lightning blade low so it dug a furrow in the ground. He'd kept it at a reasonable charge, what he'd used to train Naruto's son long ago. It wasn't as lethal as a true strike, but it wouldn't tickle either. He raised his hand towards Kakashi, who was mirroring his actions almost like a dance. Their gazes met as the lightning shattered around them, Indra's bright blue chakra sparking off of Kakashi's silver white. As equal and opposite charge cancelled each other out, their hands locked together and their foreheads collided with a sickening crack that had several of the spectators wince in sympathetic pain. Pain neither of them felt, because they were both deep inside their own heads. Genjutsu battles were always intense for the participants, but boring for the audience, which is why skilled Genjutsu users rarely called for excitement in the Chunin exams. While a man played shamisen with his opponent's leg tendons and they struggled desperately to break away from the pain or the smell, or the sound, all the visiting daimyos saw were two shinobi staring at each other, teeth clenched, muscles straining. Sasuke had a number of genjutsu in his arsenal he'd selected for this battle. Nothing as draining as the Tsukiyomi, and nothing especially painful, but enough to make his respectable aptitude at genjutsu clear. Kakashi woke up tied to a pole in the middle of a grassy field and the rumbling of an empty stomach. The Jonin rippled his chakra as he twisted the ropes, but the mental bonds held tight. Sasuke had layered his defenses, knowing each one would slow Kakashi for perhaps 2 seconds. 37 layers, with a surprise at the end. As Kakashi slowly created some slack in the rope around his wrists and burned through layers 1 to 25, Indra stepped from nowhere, a tomato in hand, and took a bite out of it. He let out a hum of uchihis purely to irritate Kakashi and waved the imaginary fruit in front of the Hatake's highly sensitive nose. Want any? Kakashi was equally casual, examining the structure of the genjutsu with a professional air as he broke through layers 26 to 30. Mama, Uchiha-san, you certainly are a well-rounded shinobi. Do you have any real weaknesses a trapped fellow like me could exploit? Blonde hair, big blue eyes, and a slightly fanged smile, but Indra would rather rip out his only eye than reveal that particular detail. Only my family. He gestured and the field was covered in gravestones bearing the Uchiha fan. But that's not surprising, in my present circumstances. One of the gravestones flickered, a woman covered in blood, mud, and rain glaring at Sasuke's back as she silently shouted. Kakashi very carefully did not stare at her, but layer 31 took 3 seconds longer to break than it should have. The gravestone next to her flickered out and a man in orange looked at Indra's back, mouth set but blue eyes full of emotion. The rest of his features were obscured by mud and black, sizzling patches that ate into the muscle of his cheeks. It was clear they had both been part of the same scene, repeating a few seconds in silence behind their caster. Sasuke cleared his throat and the field was empty and looked down at the ground in silence as Kakashi's eyes narrowed. It was quite likely this was another layer of the genjutsu, but Indra's body language radiated embarrassment and something familiar. Kakashi ignored genjutsu layer 32 as he looked up at Indra, but the field was darkening into nighttime, shadow covering the Uchiha's features. Like I said, Kakashi, not surprising. He wiped at his face absently, as if the mud or blood was still there, and in the instant of distraction, the Leaf Jonin drove through layers 32 to 37 in one shove to stand up, the ropes falling away. Indra looked up, but Kakashi had his hands on the Uchiha's shoulders. Sorry, said Kakashi as he brought his forehead forward in a mirror of the head but still grinding against his real self. The Uchiha exploded in a puff of white smoke. A very large puff of white smoke. And in that smoke, thin hips, wiry arms, and a sultry look straight out of Ika Ika Paradise. Layer 38 Sexy Jutsu. No, I'm sorry, murmured Indra as his ex-sensei vainly attempted to stem the explosion of blood from underneath the mask. How why, gargled Kakashi as his knees hit the illusionary grass. Now Indra was smiling, even if it was a little sad and nostalgic. Because no one will ever believe you. To the rest of the audience, watching in rapt silence, 3 things happened almost simultaneously. Tears began to stream from the Uchiha's only eye as he fell to his knees laughing and clutching his stomach. Kakashi's nose became a fountain of blood and he staggered backward as if Choza Akimichi had just hit him with a full expanded roundhouse kick. To everyone involved it looked like a tie and Kakashi would swear it was until his dying day. The spectators erupted. Chapter 22, A few more memories and resignation. Danzo turned sheet white. He had been alive for 76 years and he had never, ever, heard an Uchiha laugh. Chuckle, yes, as the Hokage was chuckling now, partly out of amusement, partly out of sheer disbelief. Genma emerged from behind a sturdy-looking pine and looked between the 2 combatants, both lying on the grass, in no shape to continue. He glanced up at the Hokage. It looks like a tie to me, Lord Hokage. The judges were forced to lip read over the uproar from the stands. Sasuke had both his arms outstretched, gesturing angrily at the field while Mise Hitari Anko jabbed a finger in his face and held up several promissory notes. 2 of the Umbu had moved in to protect Sakura and Naruto who were trying, vainly, to make sense of the dozens of people trying to cash out. Might Guy was offering Kakashi a dark green handkerchief while Inoichi Yamanaka and one of the medical ninja were levering Indra Uchiha into a sitting position and trying not to look as disturbed as they felt. For a medical professional and a psychological intelligence expert, laughing Uchiha never meant anything good. This madness went on for 20 minutes. When the dust had settled, the shinobi offered one another the seal of reconciliation, bowed to the Hokage and assembled villagers, and vanished in a simultaneous and uncoordinated shunshin. It took Kakashi an hour of silence at the memorial stone to compose his thoughts and another half hour to describe the battle, which had lasted exactly 2 minutes and 37 seconds and ended in a tie. Indra had made it halfway to the Uchiha district before he collapsed onto a roof, sides heaving with laughter and regret in equal measure. Probably because he was mentally unstable, again, but the grief he had deliberately seeded into the jutsu had now entwined itself with the image of his Naruto trying to frown at him while laughing. Disappointed Sasuke hadn't clued him in on the joke, but cackling mad with delight the famously stuck-up Sasuke Uchiha had finally performed the sexy jutsu. It was, after all, the jutsu that laid low a goddess. The next day, Kakashi stood in front of his Hokage and delivered his assessment. His back was straight, his tone precise, every inch the professional soldier he had been since he was 8 years old. The tissues stuffed up his nose made his mask puff out slightly and muffled his noise just a bit, but the Hokage drank in every word. The flawless use of Kakashi's own Chidori technique, the unorthodox fighting style based around manipulating his body and sword in surprising and illogical ways, the strong overhead chops that suggested time spent in the Mist Village, the complicated swap from overhand to reverse grip blade work in seconds that screamed cloud, to the carefully husbanded jutsu that showed competence without revealing secrets to the crowd. The well-crafted, respectable genjutsu strong enough to immobilize a jonin but not kill, followed by the underhanded, brutal, knockout punch of the 38th level of the illusion. Genma had specified no dirty fighting and Indra's taijutsu and kenjutsu had been scrupulously fair, but that last illusion. Kakashi knew, deep in his bones, it meant that either the man was as big a pervert as himself, or had known someone who was. Fighting like that wasn't just dirty, it was filthy enough to belong to the genjutsu equivalent of a drunken alley brawl at 2 a.m. Someone who could do that in one area of combat, could do it in any area of combat they possessed. Because it wasn't just that it was a perverted jutsu, he knew those existed. There were areas of Naruto's neighborhood which specialized in such things. It was the 1-2 knockout combo of genuine emotion and pain, with a joke hidden underneath. He had always known to look underneath the underneath, it was a maxim he drilled into new Umbu agents, but he'd grown used to jokes covering up emotional anguish. They were shinobi, that was how they coped. To see the opposite had thrown him, genuinely taken all the pieces of the mysterious Indra Uchiha puzzle and scattered them in the air, just when he'd almost made sense of the man. He said this, or something like it, to his Hokage, and the old man looked at him with weary eyes. A surplus puzzle piece, muttered the Sandaime. A piece from some other puzzle, from some other life? Some other person? Some other village? There's too much missing, sir, said Kakashi. Too much he could be lying about, or twisting. Everything fits perfectly, until it doesn't. It's a careless, ridiculous move for a spy, no matter his loyalty. It's thumbing your nose at the exploding tag attached to your face. The Hokage lit his pipe and leaned back in his chair silently. It was just the two of them for the moment, late afternoon sunlight streaming in through the windows and heating the room. Kakashi continued ranting. Much of what he has said is ridiculous, fantastical, even. He came to us from a ceiling jutsu or some unknown space-time jutsu, nearly dead from exhaustion and blood loss, made the most conspicuous arrival he could have possibly made short of riding up to the gates on the back of a biju. He tells us he had an eye that could see the future and gives us pages and pages of intelligence we now have to spend the next 5 months verifying just in case a single scrap is true. He says there's a rogue Uchiha with a plan to do dash. He waved his hands in the air. Something with the moon and a huge chakra monster. Something out of ancient legends or heavy psychotropic drugs. And yet, said the Hokage, he believes every word of what he says. Kakashi continued. From his genjutsu, it seems he is quite good at letting honest feelings do dishonest work. He showed me something that pained him, so that he could take advantage of my vulnerability, instead of the other way round. I thought we'd need Inoichi to get him to show us any of his cards at all, but he's already laid them out freely. Dead family, regrets, a sense of responsibility, a history with an Uzumaki. The Hokage caught his eye and held it, hitting a little too close to home? The look asked. Kakashi had to look away, but the Hokage pressed his attack. Inoichi trusts him. He allowed us into his mind when we caught him trying to construct a false identity and admitted his deception. Whatever he said to Danzo has the man tighter than a plucked bowstring, and I've never seen Danzo upset without a reason. Kakashi was curt. You know my feelings on the counselor, sir. The Hokage was no longer looking at him, but instead at the curl of pipe smoke drifting around the ceiling. Kakashi wondered if he saw anything there the rest of them failed to see. Even after all the horrible decisions, all the mistrust, the consequences, he was still the Sandaime Hokage. Kakashi trusted him despite the rows of the village's dead that could be laid at his feet. Of course, Kakashi's pile of bodies was only slightly smaller, and far more painful. On that note, Kakashi took a deep breath. "Sir, I would like to submit my resignation from the Umbu Black Ops and rejoin the Standard Jonin forces, starting next week." Now the Hokage was paying attention. "Oh, really? You attempted to resign once before, Kakashi, and I refused you. What has changed?" It took effort, but Kakashi met his superior's eyes instead of burying them in an Ika-Ika book. "I have heard some of my colleagues discuss my familiarity with Sasuke Uchiha and Naruto Uzumaki and agree with them it is unprofessional for an Umbu agent. However, I feel my continued presence in their lives will be of mutual benefit and would allow for further examination of Indra Uchiha in a non-professional context." The Hokage took another draft of his pipe but still said nothing, so Kakashi continued to press his case. "Last time we spoke, I was irrational. I had let my emotions get the better of me, but this time I know my departure from the Umbu is based on a sober consideration of my own needs and the needs of the mission, which have begun to diverge. I still wish to protect Naruto, but do not think the best place to do that is from behind an Umbu mask. That is why, with your permission, I would like to resubmit my resignation from the Umbu Black Ops." Granted. Only Kakashi's long years of training prevented his shoulders from slumping in relief. "Thank you, sir. I will inform Counselor Danzo as well and have the forms filled out by Monday. I will expect written reports if you discover anything new from this Indra Uchiha, of course. And for you to uphold standards of professionalism as a Jonin, even with your retirement from the Umbu." The Hokage pointed his pipe stem at Kakashi in a warning. "I am not letting you off the hook, Kakashi Hatake. Rather, I am giving you the latitude you desire to fully complete your mission. Take this opportunity and use it wisely." "Of course, sir." "Thank you, sir. Your generosity is appreciated." Hiruzen waved his hand in dismissal, and that was Kakashi's cue to leave. He bowed and left the office. Kakashi found Indra Uchiha sitting on top of the Konoha Hospital's water tower, in a lotus position, with his eye closed. He made no sign he was aware of Kakashi's presence, and the Jonin took the opportunity to look at the man again. The man had replaced his shredded clothes with good quality, shinobi materials. The dark blue cloak would aid night movement and was treated against rain and fire alike, as were the pants. A long-sleeved light purple shirt, soaked in the Konoha humidity, was drying in the wind. His white vest had been folded under him to cushion the metal of the water tower. A particularly strong gust of wind pushed the man's long hair back and Kakashi saw the naked hole in the man's face. It had been months and the medics had cleared him for discharge, but there was something slightly off about the hole, besides its existence. He stood in silence as the thought danced just beyond his reach. "Something purple." Indra broke the silence first, his eye still closed, corner of his mouth twitching upward. A friendly greeting. "Good evening, Kakashi." Kakashi mumbled back a greeting, but the man didn't react in any way. He seemed to be casting about how sensory types or Hyuga closed their eyes to sharpen their other senses, but Kakashi could feel no chakra activity from him. "Feel no shame, Kakashi. I'm a Jonin, we don't do shame. That jutsu made a goddess fall, once. Or," he frowned. "It will. It may. Someone had to have written a book on tenses for this situation. Or they will write it." Indra waved away the thought. "You wish to speak with me? Only to complain you're a puzzle none of us can figure out, Indra-san. Look, you've given me all these gray hairs." "Your hair was already gray, Kakashi. What you meant was you remain uncertain if you can trust me." Kakashi sat down on the edge of the tower and pulled out his faithful Ika-Ika, but Indra still did not open his eye. "Your lies and your truths are so mixed I doubt even you know which are which. I know what you showed me was true, because it felt real. Show me more, and then, I'll call you comrade." At that, Indra did open his eye, which regarded Kakashi for a long moment, before the man nodded slightly. "You get two memories, if you don't mind another genjutsu. Kakashi flicked to another page. No guidance, no table of contents, no once upon a time. No figures. They were silent as Kakashi thought, but while his eyes were unfocused on Ika Ika, Indra simply stared at the Hokage mountain. He'd spoken with those stone faces once before, lost and deeply confused about his purpose in life, before they'd all thrown themselves headlong into a war against two insane Uchiha. And here he was, facing down that war again, just as lost and uncertain. Not in himself, because he knew his purpose and conviction were ironclad. He would protect the Hidden Leaf Village, the entire shinobi world just as Itachi had done, from the shadows if necessary. His fear stemmed from twin sources but rested on the same question of fatherhood. The Naruto, Sakura, and above all Sasuke of this time knew he existed, and he'd already seen the beginnings of the bond that had forged the three of them into the strongest shinobi of the elemental nations. Sasuke wanted to know him, to know another Uchiha who could teach him how to defeat Itachi. That was the stated reason, but Indra knew his younger self was terribly, desperately lonely. However, Sarada's last words to him had shaken him to the core. She'd denounced him as a horrible, absent father and he knew he'd failed. Indra saw how his daughter had grown to coldly distance herself from him even as he assumed they'd filled that gap long ago. Now he saw what he'd thought to be comfortable silences during dinner as isolation, his frequent travels as running away from a home he hadn't known how to build. He and Sakura had worked hard during the divorce to make it as easy and understandable for their daughter as possible, but the damage might have already been done. Knowing this, could he involve himself in the lives of others again? Could he leave himself open to be hurt like that? Could he? Hey, Indra-san. He blinked, focusing back in on the spot where the stone face of the ninth Hokage would be. Had been. You got lost there, still going to offer me those memories? I've got a few ideas. Kakashi again. Indra let out a breath a shade too close to a sigh, but nodded. What memories did you have in mind? Kakashi's own visible eye gazed at his own coolly. First, show me the memory of what's made you so supposedly loyal to the Hidden Leaf. Show me why I should trust you. Indra nodded and brushed his hair back from his eye. If you're ready. Go. The Sharingan flared and the water tower spun away, to be replaced by a sunset sky, the barest traces of cliffs and trees at the edges of vision. The illusion was from Indra's point of view all those years ago in the final valley. The illusion turned to the side where his arm was gone, leaking blood. Do you get it now? A man in a shredded netting undershirt was bleeding out too, and his bright blue eyes looked exhausted underneath his short red hair. See, if you move, the wound will open up, and we'll both bleed to death. Indra's voice spoke next. I don't understand why you still stand in my way. Everyone else tried to cut their bonds with me, but you never did. Why are you so determined to stay involved with me? The man chuckled weakly. How many times do I have to tell you? Because we're friends. You can't explain something like that with words, but whenever I'd see you try to carry everything on your shoulders like that, it hurts. It hurts so bad that I just can't ignore you. The light dimmed as the Indra of the past passed out. Is this it? Asked Kakashi from somewhere in the jutsu. Not yet, we were both in and out from blood loss. This is daybreak. The viewpoint opened on the same sky, now the robin's egg blue of a crisp morning. The other man was speaking again. Guess it was too soon for you to move. I was hoping I could punch you to wake up. The past Indra laughed. You still want to fight? The man bared his teeth. Of course I do. I'll fight you as many times as it takes, dash. I accept it. Huh? I lost. A grin spread across the other man's face before he began an old familiar argument, picked up as if it had never ended. You idiot, it's not about winning or losing at all. My friend was sulking, so I thought I'd punch him to wake him up, that's all. The voices continued, but faded away as the landscape of sky, rock, and bleeding men dissipated like morning mist. Indra and Kakashi were back on top of the water tower, the faces of the Hokage monument looming in the distance. Kakashi took a step back and consulted his Ika Ika book. He hadn't expected the man to be quite so honest, but the genjutsu had been more than just images and words. Some of Indra's emotions had leaked into the illusion. Loss, yes, but surprise, gratitude, comfort, and above all, a deep, swelling love for the man in that vision. Whoever he'd been, likely the Uzumaki that Inoichi's reports mentioned, they'd been more than friends. Comrades certainly. If the relationship went deeper, well, this was a line of thought that led in the direction of feelings, which Kakashi avoided like Inyazuka avoided baths. He found his voice. Your friend, he seemed awfully devoted to you. Enough to lose an arm. What were you trying to do, that caused such a battle? Indra had turned away, facing the monument, but Kakashi could read the tenseness in the shinobi's shoulders. I thought I could do it all on my own, that to be strong, to keep the peace, I could work alone. I thought that I didn't need him. He showed me that I was wrong, that I'd been denying myself a life out of fear. Fear of what could happen if I allowed myself to live a life, not as a weapon, or a tool to keep the peace. He turned back to Kakashi with a slight grin on his face. Just the memory helped keep my head on straight, when I was about to make the same mistake all over again. Well, that's good to hear. Ready for that next memory? Indra nodded. Show me the worst day of your life. Should be pretty obvious. I would, but something happened just before I came here that might take that spot. It's too soon. Kakashi cocked his head. Sounds like you're dodging the question. Show me where you were, the night of the massacre. Indra's heart sank, but his face remained implacable. Kakashi obviously wanted to know about the Uchiha massacre, which was now tied with that last battle in the reign of Uzushio as the worst day of his life. More betrayal, loss, and death was too close to the surface, too raw. But Kakashi hadn't specified which massacre, and the war with the Otsutsuki had seen plenty of them. Indra was going to have to get used to these lies of omission, keep digging himself into this hole. That didn't mean he had to like it, it had the whiff of Ataka's own obsessive need for secrecy and control. Fine. I suppose a warning would be redundant. Kakashi's now visible Sharingan locked with his own and the Genjutsu spiraled into existence. Dark trees rushing past at tremendous speed, Indra was hurling himself through the forests on the outskirts of the Leaf Village. He'd received Seizing Hawk 2 hours ago and made all speed to the small cluster of buildings with the Uchiha crest hanging from windowsills or doorway lanterns. An old outpost filled with non-Uchiha servants or family friends, a far less visible place for Sarada to hide. His daughter had drawn in a small coterie of both ninja and civilians to help enlarge the Uchiha clan, and Indra had reluctantly given his assent. He hadn't had the stomach, nor the interest in women to rebuild the Uchiha clan, but Sarada had taken to the genetic conundrum with a scientist's fascination and a professor's love of detail work. Hiding here was a way for her to temporarily escape her cage responsibilities and prevent a decapitation strike like had occurred in Cloud. The trees opened up into the outskirts and Indra skidded to a halt. 2 bodies lay atop the red torii gate, gore staining the road beneath, but they still clutched their kunao in death grips. He noted, with a sick fascination, their heads were missing. He burst back into a full sprint down the streets, sword in his hand without a conscious thought, lightning chakra already running down the blade. More bodies, some in the streets, some in alleyways, 2 halfway under a porch they had thought to hide behind. No heads anywhere. The route normally would have called for a right turn, around Mrs. Hamashita's house, with its sturdy oak door. Indra's sword carved it in two and a leap carried him through the window beyond to a short fence, behind which lay Sarada's house/research laboratory. The back door was ripped from its hinges as Indra stormed through the dark, empty rooms, his eyes points of red and purple glowing in the dark. No overturned furniture, no craters in the roof or floor from Sarada's wrathful dragon blows. A good sign, followed by bad. A body lay upright against a doorway. Indra dove to his knees, hand-checking the body for the small scars Sarada had accumulated like most shinobi had. His own Sharingan had memorized each new one when she'd shown them off proudly and when she'd simply gained too many to comment on a new one. The thin white line from a grass nin's shuriken she'd snatched out of the air was not on the body's hand. The splash of a chemical burn on her ankle wasn't there either. Indra breathed a sigh of relief and allowed himself to look at her head, which was mercifully still attached. Not Sarada, or a Sharingan user, then. Likely just a maid or, given Sarada's hiring record, a graduate student from the Mist's Genetic Preservation School. Not assuaged, he tore through the house, but found no one else. No broken bookshelves, not an inkling that the assailants or their puppet slaves had been there. Frustration and fear finally boiled over as a purple ribcage and arm launched him out into the night. Sarada, where are you? Sarada! The scene faded and Kakashi stepped back. Well, that was dash. The attempt at levity fell flat, so Kakashi just stood there in silence. Indra's face looked a little older, more lined by what he'd seen again. Obito's Sharingan confirmed that though it had been a genjutsu, the man had not been lying. The emotions of fear, worry, self-recrimination, and slowly building anger had been real. The place itself, Kakashi was familiar with from his own genin days. It had been an area for the non-Uchiha who'd served the clan to live, alongside some of the black sheep of the family or the divorced. Obito had lived there, and even though there were perhaps only 4 out of 50 who'd possessed Sharingan, they'd been slaughtered in the massacre all the same. Indra could have very well arrived before the Umbu had and been on his way before the Leaf Ninja would have noticed him. The main compound had been full of bodies and it had taken half an hour for them to find Sasuke, when he'd been lying in the middle of the road. And the heads. Kakashi would never forget that sight, even if he hadn't possessed a Sharingan. The main branch compound had been conventional kills, but the outlying houses had gradually built up to a level of truly psychotic mutilation. Itaka lost more and more control as the killing went on, or perhaps his loathing for the main branch only redoubled on its less fortunate attendants. The psych department was still unsure. Either way, the stories matched. Your daughter. She survived. Wasn't in the area when it Desha paused as Indra chose his words. He came through. And now. Indra's voice was thick with emotion. Gone. Kakashi let the statement hang for a while in the air between them. I appreciate you showing those memories to me. Now, any particular reason you were so honest with me, when you've been as cryptic as a puzzle cube to Lord Third? Indra shrugged. I could say that a ninja like Hatake Kakashi knows enough about regrets and comrades that I could be honest with him. I could say that a long time ago, he taught me a valuable lesson and helped me meet an Uzumaki I fell in love with. I could say that from the day I crossed paths with him, he's been an enormous pain in my ass. Ma, protested Kakashi, sliding his headband back down. I don't remember any of this, and I certainly don't remember you. When did I become such a pivotal figure for a lost Uchiha? He stopped and cleared his throat. I haven't met any Uzumaki like that man, or you. A hound doesn't notice the rabbits that get away. Just the ones it catches. Were you an enemy of Konoha? No, just, in the vicinity. Wandering took me to distant shores. Odd jobs, bandit hunting. I was one of dozens, you'd never have noticed. Kakashi gave his Ika book a longing look but tucked it back into his pocket. Nice to know my reputation and sterling habits have preceded me. Indra gave a small smile. Even the leader of the Akatsuki knows who you are. Well, that's a comforting thought. They know me by now, so you're not alone on that front. Uchiha, Uzumaki, they're interested in a great many people. Kakashi felt a chill go down his spine. That's why you came back? Why you fell out of that portal on top of Sasuke? Not intentionally, but yes. Indra remembered the man he loved, hands clasped in a crumbling arena, facing Otsutsuki scouts, glowing like a star. I'm here to protect them. Protect them all. I owe it to my friend Initz, it's the last thing my daughter asked me to do. Will you help me? Kakashi looked out at his old sensei's stone face. I will not allow my comrades to die. That is absolute. I will. Again, your honesty is surprising, but appreciated. You'd like my friend Guy. Indra looked slightly sick. On that cheery note, it's time I went home. Where to? The Uchiha district, presumably. Well, that's the cheeriest you've looked since you fell into a sandbox. Kakashi was following him still, and it was making Indra's paranoia twitchy and nervous, even when the man had just agreed to help him. They took the quick route, leaping across the rooftops and walls as Indra readjusted to the Konoha he dimly remembered from his childhood, before his desertion and Pain's obliteration of the village. It's a strange thing, he admitted to his shadow, to be somewhere you belong and not recognize it. Kakashi made a non-committal noise behind his mask. Take a few missions, get to know people. You'll fit in. I did. They continued on in silence until Kakashi spoke again as they passed over the main thoroughfare. Naruto and Sasuke will probably have dinner ready for us. Indra shot a look over his shoulder and gestured for Kakashi to run next to him instead of behind. You make it sound like there are more occupants of the Uchiha district than just Sasuke. Just Naruto, he moved in at Sasuke's urging last month. Something about honoring an agreement in nightmares, I didn't catch the details. Indra thought back to his own time with Team 7. Are they driving each other crazy? It's a wonder they haven't killed each other yet, but Sakura, Cat, and I have kept them occupied with one thing or another. They have been busy then. Who's Cat? With me on their Guard detail, which will probably end soon, seeing as how you're trustworthy and not a madman or spy. They landed in the road and looked at the walls of the Uchiha district, the blue-tiled roofs gleaming in the moonlight. What's kept them busy? Asked Indra to cover his nervousness as they approached the barrier. It was keyed to only allow Uchiha or specially added chakra signatures past its barrier, and he wasn't sure how it would react to what was technically a perfect copy of Sasuke. He forced his breath to remain even and took a step forward. There was an instant of resistance, like walking through slime, or the hospital's lemon jello, but then the barrier acquiesced, and he stepped through. Kakashi chattered about weapons training, going on about his work on staff techniques with Naruto and Kat's lessons on the Crescent Moon dance, but Sasuke was only half listening. The Uchiha district loomed around him, ghosts of his old life thick in the air like flies. Waving hello to his auntie before school. The massacre and the horrible discovery. The stores and apartment buildings reconstructed over the area after Pain's almighty push obliterated what remained behind. Sarada's reinvigoration of the district as a hub for new families and genetics centers to rejuvenate the Uchiha lineage based on 2 surviving genetic bases. The Otsutsuki's initial rampage through the leaf, which he'd shown Kakashi. The final, devastating attack that had leveled the village once more and sent Sakura's crazy, desperate plan into action. Sarada, ponytail plastered to her back in the rain, begging him to be a better man. He cleared his throat and Kakashi was sensible enough to pretend ignorance as he wiped at his eye. They'd arrived. Indra took a long look at the home of his childhood, light spilling out from the windows and doors as he and Kakashi stood outside in the dark. The Jonin put a hand on his shoulder, which surprisingly enough did make Indra feel slightly better. You ready? Are any of us ever ready? Kakashi had nothing to say to that, so Indra forged ahead and knocked on what was technically his own front door. It opened to reveal Naruto Uzumaki, whose face brightened, and he called back over his shoulder. Hey, Sasuke. Kakashi-sensei and Indra-san are here, how we doin'? 3 minutes, the scallions still have to sear. Indra stepped inside and removed his shoes and cloak absently as he took in his surroundings. The house he'd remembered had been scrupulously neat, but rarely entirely used, mostly ignored in favor of the few rooms he'd used for living or training. This house was messy, likely Naruto's doing, with extra sandals piled in the corner and scrolls spread across the floor or tucked next to couch pillows. A stack of wooden swords was tucked against the back wall alongside a few kunao, and the surfaces had been dusted regularly. The clatter of dishes as well as the smell of meat and broth percolated through the air and the new arrivals inhaled appreciatively. This house looked lived in. Indra smiled and moved towards the kitchen. Anything a one-armed man can do to help. Naruto thrust a series of chopsticks and napkins at him. You can set the table, it's to the right, through the kitchen, okay. Scandalized, Naruto, that's supposed to be your job, came from the kitchen, to which Naruto stuck out his tongue. He wanted to help, Sasuke, so let him help. Why can't I do stuff in the kitchen? I've seen what you call cooking, no thanks. Go pick up those scrolls, I don't want soup dripping onto 20-year-old jutsu records. Naruto scrambled to comply, grumbling all the while, and Indra leaned against the kitchen door to observe. Sasuke had tied a white cloth to his head to corral his unruly hair and was moving back and forth between several steaming dishes. What are we having? Kitsune Udon, had to use up the scallions, and Naruto thought it would be funny. He shrugged, attempting to be casual and failing miserably. Welcome home, I guess. Indra resisted the urge to pat his younger self on the head and settled for a thumbs up with the silverware. I'm home then. Let's get started. Chapter 23, meditating on the future past. Indra allowed himself to sigh in relief as he sank down into a comfortable bed. Despite his recuperation, the early sparring and later genjutsu explanation with Kakashi had taken more out of him than he'd thought. He was just glad he didn't ache as much as a 65-year-old man should, a fortunate side effect of time travel, apparently. A small part of him remembered that this had been his parents' bed originally, but it was warm and soft, so Indra Uchiha quietly released the hidden mind jutsu and sank into sleep. He opened his eyes on the other side of the dream and once again found himself inside his own mind. The forest and swamp were gone, but the moon over the lake still shone and he could see the crags of his mountain beyond it. Inoichi had been right, it was a peaceful, beautiful place. Sasuke wandered out onto the lake and entered the lotus pose, floating on the surface of the water in unconscious imitation of the Sage of Six Paths. With all the emotional turmoil he'd been going through and the piecemeal sharing of his private moments, some restful introspection would be a wise use of his time. He closed his eyes and breathed the fresh air in deeply. In his time, industrialization had led to the rapid development of most of the hidden villages until they were neither hidden nor villages, but rather, obvious cities that still produced shinobi. The names still stuck, out of tradition, if nothing else. Sasuke thought through the many lies he had told among his truths and examined each one. Yes, he wanted to protect his clan and right the wrongs caused by Obito and Itachi. He wanted to protect and guide his younger self, as well as Naruto and Sakura. As Hashirama Senju so often said, there was always conflict, no matter the era, but he wanted to spare them the harshest ones. Even if upon learning the truth, the younger Sasuke refused to stay in the hidden leaf, he would have an experienced and emotionally stable uncle to guide him and friends he could turn to for advice. A reformed Sound Village could be another refuge, or perhaps the Hidden Rain, depending on if Nagato could be persuaded by someone other than Naruto Uzumaki. The Sasuke of this time would have options, better by far than leaping headlong into Orochimaru's clutches, for sure. Yes, the Akatsuki were a threat to the ninja world and needed to be destroyed. Whether Obito could be talked down was irrelevant, because first he would need to be captured, and someone with permanent access to a space-time ninjutsu like Kamui would be very difficult to capture in the first place. An openly emotional appeal wouldn't work, but Sasuke could gradually chip away at his vulnerabilities to break his resolve, or at least unbalance him enough to make mistakes. Mistakes Sasuke would use to ensure the Ten Tails never clawed its way out of oblivion again. Without the Ten Tails, Kaguya, or the God Tree, hopefully the devastation and slaughter of his future would never come to pass. Thoughts of his future brought Sasuke back to his own relationships. As Sarada had said, he had failed in many respects. His distant relationship with Sakura had started as he sought to understand the feelings inside himself and needed someone else to hear them. Someone who wasn't Naruto Uzumaki. Not that he couldn't trust Naruto, but Sasuke was aware that he loved the man so much, rational thought would be impossible. Naruto was a gravity well that drew Sasuke inexorably closer, so in an attempt to be honest, he had traveled instead with Sakura. He had never understood how she still carried a torch for him after all these years and his many crimes, but she was loyal and willing to listen. So, over months, then the course of a year traveling around the continent, he told her everything. He told her about the Uchiha, what the village had done, why he stayed away even now. He told her about his own feelings of failure and fear, about never measuring up to Itachi, then never killing him, now never being able to live up to his memory. How she and Naruto still had faith in him, despite everything, and how that in turn gave him hope that he could, in fact, be redeemed. How he feared what the future could bring him, if all it had brought him so far had been tinged with tragedy and pain. He feared the end of the clan if he should die, all the good and all the evil alike, now dust on the wind. Sasuke poured his heart out to Sakura and incredibly she understood. She told him her story in turn. They understood each other, perhaps for the first time since Team 7 had formed. She still traveled with him, never complaining, always willing to search out the next trafficking ring or rogue ninja. Sasuke had never learned what romantic love was. Karin had made pass after pass, but both of them knew it would never work, so they stayed harmless flirts, little in-jokes that continued for years, even as she settled down and somehow married Suijutsu, despite the fact they still bickered just as much. Hell, even he'd slept with Suijutsu once or twice, but it had only been exploratory or need-driven sex. Two lonely shinobi curled together as the world grew darker around them. He'd never had a real relationship, where he brought someone flowers, or went out to dinner, or they shared sappy remarks and kissed in public. Nothing like that. Sometimes, Sasuke thought he'd been broken so deeply, at such a fundamental level, that feeling that way for anyone was impossible for him. He'd nearly given up on himself, even as he grew to realize how deeply Sakura did in fact care for him. Was this it? Was this swelling feeling of affection, appreciation, respect, and quiet contentment what love was? At the time, Sasuke had thought so. He'd read through several romance novels. Stakeouts were boring, from Sakura's luggage, and they all seemed to agree. He didn't have the fiery, declarative passion he thought he would have, but then, Sasuke hadn't been emotionally open since the age of 7. So he acquiesced when Sakura took them on detours to restaurants in little towns, to hot springs, to the sorts of places romance novels liked to write about. When she stowed her sleeping bag and climbed into his, he thought it was what they both wanted, that of course it was love. Stupid. The sex wasn't as pleasurable as the romance novels said it would be, but that wasn't a surprise as much as it was a deep embarrassment for both of them. Sakura was a doctor, and could play the human body like an instrument, but that didn't mean either of them were naturally gifted. Pleasing someone else was something you had to learn, over and over again, and no matter how many times they practiced, it never quite seemed to work. At the time, and after Sarada's birth, they'd both put it down to nerves, but it was one of the signs they both overlooked. When they'd realized Sakura was pregnant, the joy and fear Sasuke felt erased any doubts that this wasn't love. It felt like a new sun had earthed itself in his chest, like he was glowing every second of every day. He wouldn't have to be the last Uchiha. He no longer had to be alone. Boy or girl, this child would have a future, and Sasuke and Sakura set to their preparations for a new life with all the determination and precision two veteran ninja were known for. This was thrown off when Sakura had refused to stop traveling with him, and he refused to return to the Leaf. She wanted their family to stay together and Sasuke wasn't sure if he wanted his family in the Hidden Leaf at all. This was perhaps the second sign all was not well, because now there were arguments. Both of them were stubborn, uncompromising ninja, and the arguments went around and around, on all manner of subjects. Excess emotions were vented on crumbling boulders or unlucky trees, but pregnancy was supposed to be stressful, wasn't it? When it turned out they'd argued or traveled too long, and that Sakura's water had broken, everything else had been cast aside in the med dash to find the nearest doctor. Sakura was an extremely gifted medical ninja with a high pain tolerance, but managing her own premature childbirth was another thing altogether. The memory of a vast purple-armored behemoth plowing through the countryside, with Sakura clinging to him and cursing the Uchiha, herself, and every living thing in 10 kilometers, would stay with him for the rest of his days. In one of the most terrifyingly surreal experiences of his life, for Orochimaru and Karin had helped Sakura deliver the baby while Sasuke paced up and down outside the delivery room. That had been another strong point in the snake's favor, but the fear he had felt then, unable to see what the Sun-In was doing to his wife and child, caused him to cleave through one or two rock walls in frustration. But Karin had been adamant. "Let us work and stay out of our way, Sasuke. Orochimaru knows what he's doing, and I'll make sure your baby is safe, I promise." That promise alone had stayed his hand and kept him anywhere close to steady for the hours and hours they waited outside. Well, that and Yugo's restraining arms, in a surreal inversion of their normal dynamic. But it was all worth it when the cursing stopped, and a tiny voice began to wail. The moment he'd first held his daughter in his arms, Sasuke felt sure he'd made the right decision. And it was the right decision, Sasuke was still sure of that. Even with all the acrimony and heartbreak that followed, even with Sarada's last bitter words still ringing in his mind, Sasuke still did not regret this. Bringing Sarada Uchiha into the world had been a good thing, a beautiful thing. Even if she hadn't become the 9th Hokage, even if she'd taken the Harano name instead, the world was a better place with her in it. With her, Sasuke first knew, in his bones, what true, unconditional love was. Unfortunately, that was also when he realized he did not have that same love for Sakura. He didn't abandon them, he wasn't a complete tool. He stayed in the Leaf Village, taking no missions, no greater purpose beyond raising his daughter. He stayed for 4 years, until she could walk and talk and play on her own. He made sure she had memories of him, good memories, of trips to the bookstore or down the street to play with other children, including Boruto. Memories of sitting on his lap with a sippy cup and a stuffed elephant, and oh, how it all ached now. The love and trust that shone from those memories bumped up against the disappointment and mistrust she'd shown him 35 years later, and the happy memories were ripped in half. Sasuke sank beneath the water of his soul and didn't bother to swim. The memories came faster now. Before Sasuke had traveled with Sakura, the wrenching pain in his chest he'd felt when learning of Naruto's marriage to the Hyuga heiress, that should have been another sign. His silent avoidance of the wedding and a hawk-delivered congratulations should have been another. How, the moment he'd left the village, and his family for the first time, his heart leapt to be back on the open road. His non-answers when years later Sarada had confronted him and asked about Karen. So many signs things were heading in the wrong direction, but they'd both refused to accept it. Sakura, because she was finally with someone she still thought she loved, and Sasuke, because he refused to admit their happiness was built upon unstable foundations. That he loved Naruto Uzumaki, and not her. Not the way she thought he did, not the way she wanted to be loved. They both held on, for Sarada's sake above all else, for as long as they could. 2 years after her Chunin exams, as the Jijin at Satsuki scare finally wound down, after 2 bottles of wine and alone together at their kitchen table, they both admitted their marriage wasn't going to work anymore. She wanted more than he could give her, and he couldn't fake it any longer. What surprised them both about it was that neither of them was actually surprised. Or even all that angry. Another point in favor of divorce, really. If they'd both felt strongly about each other, then there would have been fights, screaming, feelings of betrayal or disappointment at the very least. Instead, there was just a quiet exhaustion, as if Sasuke and Sakura had known this was going to happen and were glad divorce was going to be easy after all. They both went to great lengths to keep the divorce amiable, respectable, and above all, understandable for Sarada. And the worst part was, up until his daughter had spat venom at him on a pouring, desperate night in Uzushio ruins, Sasuke really thought they had succeeded. He'd taken more missions around and inside the Leaf Village, even D-ranks, to stay near his daughter and be as supportive as possible, or to stay away if that's what she wanted. Sasuke spent a great deal of time with Sai, who'd become something of an emotional translator for ex-root agents, to communicate the whys and hows beyond all the assumptions they had made that sustained their marriage for 15 years. Sakura had spoken with Ino, partly for emotional support, partly to make sure her best friend didn't lock Sasuke's mind into a trout, and together they explained the awful, painful truth. Sometimes love isn't built to last. Sometimes, people think they're in love and never realize the difference. Sometimes, living as someone you're not is as exhausting as an S-rank mission. Sometimes, it just doesn't work. And they'd thought Sarada had acclimated well. Sure, it was the catalyst for the awakening of her Manjikyo Sharingan, a beautiful Mobius diamond pattern she almost never used, and sure, both of her parents had taken their fair share of crying rants, slammed doors, and chakra-enhanced punches to the face. But when Sarada saw how Sasuke's face lit up when Naruto entered the house, when Sakura swept Ino off her feet and danced across the living room carpet singing for the first time in years, she had smiled and said she understood. She could never be fully happy, but she understood. And Sasuke had thought it had all gone so well. Just like the thread of the Otsutsuki, really. Everything is going well, the past put aside, right up until it isn't. Because the past is a tricky thing and has a way of following you home, no matter how hard you try and lose it. Sasuke had sunken deep into the lake by now. Deep enough that if this was the real world, he would have drowned halfway back to the surface. But he wasn't in the real world, he was inside his own mind, so breathing was a strictly optional action. He opened his eyes and frowned, for dozens of thick spiked chains were wrapped around his body and extended, taut as bowstrings, into the darkness below him. Real clever Sasuke, he muttered to himself. Great metaphor for guilt and responsibility, really had to reach for that one, didn't you? Shaking his head at his own subconscious, he obligingly swam deeper, following the largest concentration of chains. If I gain spiritual enlightenment at the end of this, does that unlock some new Sharingan power, he mused, knowing the idea was laughable. Do I just float free of all my problems and gain true flight like Naruto's 6 paths form? become a being of pure energy or whatever like the sage. Such thoughts were deeply stupid, he knew. Even juvenile, making light of his failures and situation, but Sasuke had gone straight through the curse of madness and come out the other side, so in a sense he'd already hit rock bottom at the age of 16. To his slight surprise, Sasuke found as he dove deeper that the water became clearer, the direction of the chains more obvious. After a few more strokes, he found himself floating just under another surface, looking into the dream of his younger self once more. He took a moment to study it. Another nightmare, where his mother was flying up and away from him on shadowy, blood-drenched wings, with a red-haired woman in her arms. A much younger Sasuke was crying out, some tear-soaked plea, but the barrier between his dream and his older self muffled the sound. Sasuke silently debated if entering this dream was a good idea, if knocking politely was even possible, if his experiences with Sarada had. Something vast moved in front of the surface, obscuring Sasuke's view of his younger self. His eye narrowed and he swam forward until he was inches away from the barrier. The vast shape moved again and Sasuke caught a glimpse of a flowing orange form before it blocked him again. It can't be. The shape turned and Sasuke saw teeth as long as a man and as sharp as scalpels bare themselves in a parody of a grin. Red slitted eyes swam into view above the mouth and Sasuke unconsciously shrank back. This hatred, this toxic power, the smell of forest fires, burnt meat, and the apocalypse. He'd felt them before, the first time he'd battled Naruto. The Nine Tails was out of its cage. Well, another Uchiha. And here I'd hoped you were all dead, more's the pity. It snarled and even with this strange barrier between them, Sasuke could still hear it perfectly clearly. If you want to enslave me again with that repulsive Sharingan, you'll find the fourth Hokage seal to be a devilishly tricky bit of business in that regard. For that alone, I may yet remain in these children until your ilk are ash on the wind. Now leave me to my work. The fox made to turn away but Sasuke found his voice. What are you doing to the boy? What use is he to you if you're bound inside an Uzumaki? Now the fox laughed, a deep and ugly thing, suggestive of carrion crows and jokes before a murder. So many uses, none of which concern you, so either fight or flee back to slumber, I care little. It breathed deeply then turned back to him, a calculating look crawling over its massive face. Then again, you stink of sin as well. Cravenness, betrayal, murder, deception, home-wrecking. Nothing unique, but so very fresh. The thing actually licked its lips as Sasuke stared in horror. He'd never seen the Nine Tails do anything, or say anything like this, and if he had, Naruto had never related. I might just consume your nightmares as well, once I'm done with my appetizer. The Nine Tails held up a single claw, upon which was the motionless body of the younger Sasuke, dangling by his shirt. That did it. Sasuke burst through the barrier with the sound of shattered glass and an oath of vengeance on his lips. He landed on the hard wooden floor of the Uchiha dojo, which seemed both its normal size and impossibly large as the space stretched to accommodate the fox spirit. Sasuke drew his sword and felt his chakra rise along with his will. He'd fought the wilder, untamed Kyuubi only once, with one tail of chakra, and only Naruto's mercy had kept it from killing him. To face its full power, in a mental space neither of them controlled but which Sasuke was loath to damage, was a daunting task. He could certainly save the boy, drive the Nine Tails out of their shared mind space, but at what cost? He could permanently damage himself, or the younger Sasuke to imbecility, and the fox, as an inhuman chakra construct, would be no worse for wear. The fox lashed out at him and Sasuke backflipped away, retaliating with his sword on the riposte. The Nine Tails hissed at the line of red that opened on its paw, but the wound closed over as soon as it had opened, and Sasuke doubted the same would happen for him if one of those claws found its mark. He had to stall while he came up with a plan, only question was if the Nine Tails would play along. So what woke you up so early? He asked, zigzagging towards the beast and flinging lightning-enhanced shuriken in its direction that it ignored. First time I saw you wake up, Naruto was in a towering rage fit to level a mountain. I'm noticing the landscape looks the same, so why lurk here? The Biju lashed its tails in his direction, sending a tornado of cutting blades his way and followed it with a vicious bite. The Uchiha boy's very existence sparked anger in the runt, and their fighting made me strong. Now, they sleep under the same roof and I can devour all the nightmares spawned by your cursed clan. All thanks to you, newcomer, you pathetic fool. When I get out, I'll blind you first, but devour you last, so you have the privilege of hearing your district, and the fourth Hokage-stemmed village burn to the ground. Sasuke ran sideways, seeking to avoid the windstorm, and leaped upwards, seeking the high ground as enormous teeth clashed together inches from his feet. He held his sword up and black fire crawled along its length. I don't want to hurt you, Lord Kurama, but you must release the boy. The fox froze, its hair standing on end as it withdrew and glared at him with surprise and deep suspicion. How do you know that name? Not even Madara could have pried it out of me, if he'd ever bothered to ask. Where was it carved? That damned Uchiha tablet? I'll crush it to dust. Sasuke had jumped to nearly chest height with the Biju, but it wasn't enough to allow the blow he had hoped for. As soon as his feet hit the ground, he bent into a formal bow of deep respect. Lord Jayaki sends his regards, Lord Kurama, but I came to apologize on behalf of my clan. I only ask that you release a small boy who has never participated in any action against you or your kin. He's an Uchiha, just as you are. More eyes, more ways to keep me bound, just like your damn first Hokage, just like everyone. Give me one reason I should release him. Because if you devour his mind, Naruto will never free you. He will mourn his friend and devote every moment of his days to keeping you bound as tightly as he can manage. I've seen him fight alongside you and I in battles only the tailed beasts can compete in. He could and will set you all free one day, but if you destroy his friend, he will stop at nothing to deny you. The fox snorted and curled its tails in front of its body in a defensive gesture. Pretty words from a silver, lying tongue. How can you possibly know what will happen, what the whelp would do? Sasuke grinned and tapped his empty eye socket. I've seen the future, Lord Kurama, and bring you a warning as well as hope tonight. Believe me or not, I will say my piece, and if you release the boy, we need never see each other again. Bared Teeth spoke to how likely that would be, but Sasuke had to try. Speak then, and be gone. I have no patience for any mortal, least among them an Uchiha. With a worried glance at his still unmoving counterpart, Sasuke began to speak. He told the 9 tales of Madara and Obito's med plan, of Black Zetsu and his desire to bring back the 10 tails in Kaguya, which would mean the death of all the tailed beasts, sealed inside a monster for eternity, or devoured by cannibalistic, power-hungry Otsutsuki from the stars. At first his audience of one looked contemptuous, but as he spoke of the sage's worry for his mother's return, and the names of each one of the tailed beasts Naruto had let slip over the years, the fox's face became grave. Your warnings are grave, if they are to be credited with an ounce of truth, but unlikely. My brothers and sisters are all sealed tightly away to protect your precious human treaties and borders. No human, however depraved, or patient, could unseal us in the manner you spoke of. What if that human had the Rinnegan? If the 9 tails had been paying attention before, the creature's entire vast psyche was focused on Sasuke now, and it felt like being slowly roasted alive. Those eyes belonged to the old man and his brother alone. No one else. The sheer power would cause their brains to leak from their ears, their human chakra systems sucked dry to feed the Rinnegan's power. You layer lies upon lies, Uchiha. If that human was an Uzumaki. Kurama froze, eyes staring into the distance as it contemplated the horrible plausibility. Perhaps. But only 1 in 200 could even attempt to host such sacred eyes, and the Uzumaki were never that numerous. If you know this to be true, what is this cur's name, so that I may obliterate his memory from every rock and scroll on the continent? Sasuke thought. If he played his cards right, the tailed beasts could unite before a single one of them was sealed inside the Gedo statue and perhaps even take out Pain himself. But he thought of the Hidden Rain village, one of the last surviving bastions during the Otsutsuki War, and a refuge for thousands upon thousands of orphaned or starving refugees. He thought about what he'd scribbled out on a piece of stationery a month earlier. Reunite Uzumaki. For all his crimes, Nagato was still trying to seek peace, and he'd already achieved it within the Land of Rain. He'd been in the same position himself, a boy lost and at the end of his rope, with special eyes, and Obito whispering in his ear, poisoning him against the Leaf Village and the entire shinobi system. His words had worked because many of them were true, but if Obito had not been there, the mono-eyed Uchiha shook his head. He would try to split the difference. This man is aware of the sacred duty those eyes carry and is trying his best to bring peace. But like I once was, he has been corrupted by a hateful Uchiha, whose black legacy you and I both now seek to erase from the world. If you won't fight for me, for Naruto, for any human, then fight for Lord Hage Oromo. For the future his eyes saw, for your siblings, who are now threatened by the same eyes that created them, for a future where you are free. I don't know if you can reach the others from where you are inside Naruto, but you must try. The humans will not listen to me, but you know. You know what I say is the truth, despite your caution. So please, help me so that I can help you. Let the boy go. They stood there in silence for a long time, if time in fact passed inside an unconscious mind. Sasuke stood silently, feet planted, naked sword held at his side, dark eyes entreating the Biju who had the most reason to loathe the Uchiha. Kurama held up the tiny figure of his counterpart between his claws, and for a moment Sasuke was terrified the boy would be snuffed out just to spite him. Then the fox sniffed disdainfully and tossed the spirit in his direction. Sasuke sprinted forward, sword discarded as he slid to catch the boy in between one arm and a stump. Like I said, a silver tongue for one of the Uchiha. The tone made it clear it wasn't a compliment. If the risks are as large as you say, then I'll see what I can do. The old man wouldn't like his work being perverted like this, and neither do I. But, the Biju pointed one massive claw forward, stabbing Sasuke slightly in the chest, driving an inch or two in before withdrawing. If you try to trick us, to use your Demsharinon on any one of my siblings, no matter what reason, I will devour these children you care for so much and feed you the leftovers. Got it? Sasuke nodded, not trusting himself to speak further. And I still get to eat the boy's nightmares. The old man gave me a purpose as well, and for now, this is the closest I'm gonna get. With a swish of tails, the fox turned on itself and was gone. The space around them shrank to normal proportions once more and the stench of toxic chakra lessened. His younger self slept on within his own mind, and Sasuke gently lowered him to the dojo floor, then turned to where he had come from, where a watery shimmer remained. Almost looking forward to the water and heavy chains, he dove back in with a sigh of relief. Safe within his own dreaming mind, Sasuke finally allowed himself to breathe again, then remembered he was still underwater. Choking and resigning himself to a long swim to the surface, one thought still couldn't help but stick in his mind. That was way too close. Chapter 24, Planting Trees You'll Never Get to See. Indra's sleep wasn't very restful, but he woke up early anyway. He'd tossed and turned the rest of the night, drifting between the deep sleep that allowed him to truly rest in his subconscious, and the vague half-awareness of surroundings most ninja cat-napped in. He'd shrugged into Indra's personality just like he'd shrugged into his pants and a thin undershirt to be presentable before wandering aimlessly around the space and adjoined bathroom. As he did, Indra remembered that this was his parents' room, that he'd slept in his parents' bed, and was once again in the house he'd grown up in. The bathroom was surprisingly clean, when part of Indra had expected a thick layer of dust, that Sasuke would never encroach on what had been his parents' private space, but someone had taken the effort anyway and he was glad. There was a fresh-looking toothbrush and some supplies bunched together on the counter, as well as a razor and shaving cream. Possibly Kakashi, then. Sasuke wouldn't think to add shaving supplies, he was still years away from puberty. As Indra made his way through the hallways of a home he'd nearly forgotten about, yet somehow still remembered like the back of his hand, his thoughts kept drifting back to Sasuke, and to Sarada, comparing the two. His younger self had a great deal of emotional baggage to work through, an effort that, along with the inevitable Uchiha revelations, would probably take most of his teenage years to deal with. Indra knew how his younger self thought, was perhaps early enough to turn him away from the path of hatred, and would absolutely enlist Naruto and Sakura in that endeavor. On the other hand, considering his failures as a father with Sarada, he needed perspective, advice, and help from someone who wasn't the walking disaster named Hatake Kakashi. Who would fit the bill? Indra entered the kitchen and rustled through the cupboards as he thought. He would have to balance the serious world missions needed to hunt down the Akatsuki and Orochimaru with being a supportive presence for the children and do so better than last time. He couldn't afford to run away from emotional attachment, no matter how much more efficient it would be. The visual of Sarada's rain-streaked, contemptuous gaze was reminder enough. It was very early, but perhaps he could. What are you looking for? Sasuke's voice came from behind him and Indra didn't bother to turn around. Tea kettle. You drink tea? Not really. Kakashi said you'd want coffee in the mornings, most ninja do. Indra let out something that was half a sigh and half a huff of exasperation. Coffee is a luxury when wandering the elemental nations, tea is much more accessible. I've seen ninja get addicted to coffee and go into withdrawal on long missions, not a pretty picture. He could feel Sasuke's scowl behind him. You can't get addicted to coffee. The MNHMM that emerged from his throat was skeptical. He searched for a few more minutes before Sasuke took pity on him. It's next to your knees, on the bottom left. His younger self moved across the room and began removing vegetables from the fridge, throwing them into the already open blender. As Indra's tea kettle quickly heated up, the roar of the blender shattered the silence of the morning and Indra winced internally as Sasuke poured the resulting concoction into a tall glass and made to leave. No, come and sit. Sasuke turned and gave him a blank look, wondering where this was going. Indra crossed to the kitchen table and pulled out an inviting chair before sliding into his own, with his back to the wall and a commanding view of the space. Force of habit. He spoke again. Kakashi mentioned you'd been training, and you said you wanted to spar. Indulge your new uncle. Something in Indra's stomach twisted briefly as he prodded what he knew would be a sore spot for his younger self, but the guilt and training topic did the trick. Sasuke obligingly joined him and began sucking down his smoothie in silence. For once, Indra was going to have to be the talkative one in this relationship. I heard you've been working with your Umbu guard, Katsan, on sword techniques. What prompted this? Sasuke swallowed and stared into Indra's one visible eye almost hidden behind the landscape of black hair and bandages. Naruto and I got bored, and Kakashi was willing to train. Kat got dragged in to teach me the crescent moon dance technique. She's had me cutting sticks and doing basic form movements. It's easy. Indra had absolutely no idea what the crescent moon dance was. Did she show you what the end result was, give you a demonstration? Sasuke gave a short nod. A combination of a genjutsu and a taijutsu technique to deceive the opponent reading your sword strikes. It could be helpful against dash. The pause was minute, barely there, but Sasuke continued anyways. Attack is Sharingan. Indra's tea kettle whistled as the water boiled, so he broke eye contact to attend to it. He was going to lead Sasuke into this conversation, but the boy had brought it up first. You're young, but already preparing to kill him. Not surprising, given our clan's history of honor and vengeance. What techniques do you know so far? He bobbed the tea bag up and down by its string to allow the leaves within to spread their flavor through his cup as he returned to the table. Sasuke looked pleased as he listed off his training regime, followed by his jutsu. I've already mastered the Shuriken deflection jutsu and am working on Kunao deflection. My target accuracy at the standard distances is at 92%. Our ninja class just finished learning the principles of genjutsu, and I plan to work further on them with Sakura Haruno in class today. With Katsan I've completed the first 5 katas for the crescent moon dance and have already mastered the great fireball jutsu. That's my boy. Indra knew without a doubt they were both thinking of the same memory, in that moment. Unsettled, he nodded and took a sip of his tea to buy himself time as Sasuke emptied his own glass and returned to the half-full blender to finish off his concoction. Excellent work, Sasuke. Do you plan to master the rest of the Uchiha's fire techniques? The Phoenix Flower, the Rising Dragon, the Flaming Shuriken, perhaps the Majestic Destroyer Flame, one day? That's good. Then Indra dropped the bombshell. Why do you think those techniques will ever help you beat Itachi? Sasuke's head snapped around and he glared at his uncle. Those are the Uchiha clan's techniques, passed down through generations. I'll kill him with Uchiha techniques and an Uchiha sword. I'll be better at our techniques than he is. I'll be better than him, and our clan can rest easily. Indra sipped at his tea. They're resting easily now, Sasuke. The appropriate rites have been performed dash. No, they're not. Sasuke was grinding his teeth and he carefully set the blender in the sink, which Indra knew meant his younger self was struggling not to slam it down. Attack is still alive, still walking free, so mother and father and they can't rest until I kill him and avenge the clan. Who told you that? Isn't it obvious? Indra folded his arm across his stump. Explain it to me. The scrolls said that a murdered Uchiha will demand vengeance, that even after their ashes on the wind, their spirits will not rest until the guilty party is dead at Uchiha hands. The scrolls were written in the Warring States era, before even the third Hokage was born. And now there's one more loyal Uchiha in the village than there was last month. It still doesn't have to be you. Of course it does. Indra had never seen someone drink a smoothie with such emphasis. He's my brother, he killed my parents, it's my responsibility. Indra sighed. This would make 2 lifetimes now spent cleaning up Itachi and the Leaf's messes, and sometimes his annoyance with his dead brother outweighed the love he still felt. I'm guessing Itachi told you that, didn't he? Sasuke scowled, but didn't argue, so Indra pressed his point home. Why would you listen to anything a murdering lunatic had to say? Because it's still my responsibility. Because he was right. Because he wanted me to kill him, and with the Sharingan, I'm the only one who can. Indra put on a hurt expression, but inwardly he was grinning. Sasuke was playing right into his argument, just as he knew the boy would. So Kakashi and I don't count. We've got a full set of Sharingan between us, and the Mangekyo. We could take him. This was, perhaps, stretching the truth, but a fight like that was years away. He had time to train, and he intended to make sure Kakashi did too. Sasuke's scowl only deepened. You could, but it wouldn't be right. Show me in the scrolls where it says an Uchiha bloodline guardian and the teammate of a defector don't get to kill him before his younger brother. Sasuke wasn't going to give up, and Indra didn't expect him to. It has to be me, uncle. It just has to, there's no other way. He'd planted the idea, so Indra moved on. Assuming your vengeance comes first, you'd use the Uchiha clan techniques to beat him. At a nod, he continued. And how would you become better than Itachi Uchiha, a natural genius, at techniques he already knows, and who has a 6-year head start? Sasuke shoved his empty glass towards the center of the table. I'll train harder, get better. Indra allowed his one visible eyebrow to rise and lifted a corner of his mouth into a smirk he knew would infuriate Sasuke. Sasuke hated condescension and superiority more than anything. That's a hope, not a plan. He's an S-rank missing nin, on the run from every village with a bingo book and some very good bounty hunters. Indra made a mental note to himself. Contact Madame Zhuo when time permits. The irascible bounty hunter was now quite younger and likely still as useful an information broker. Start pinning down Itachi's movements with spies outside of Danzo's control. Sasuke would also like her tomatoes. The boy in question was staring at him in frustration, so Indra finished his tea. Fighting the best of the Uchiha with Uchiha techniques, while admirable and traditional, is a fool's game. You will never beat him that way. Sasuke opened his mouth to object, but Indra barreled on. Sasuke. You will beat Itachi by not playing his game. He wants you to come after him. He wants you to sink into hatred and training day after day until you live for nothing but to kill him. I'm not going to just give up dash. I'm not asking you to. Think, Sasuke Uchiha. What jutsu will Itachi Uchiha not expect, what strategies will he not have plans for? He'll have plans for everything, muttered Sasuke sullenly. He's Itachi the genius, like you said. That's still what he wants you to think. Listen, I've been around the world, fought a lot of strange people. I don't know what the crescent moon dance is, I had to ask you. It's a technique you're learning from an Umbu agent. It's unusual, it's unorthodox, it's unexpected. The younger boy snorted. What, you want me to fight like Naruto? No brain, improvise everything? The unpredictable knucklehead. Despite the many amusing images that thought conjured, especially layer 38 of his Kakashi-tailored genjutsu, Indra kept a straight face. Something like that. Keep training with the Uchiha techniques but start thinking about others. What could you do, what focus would Itachi never expect? He wants you to be an Uchiha, a frontline fighter with a sword and fire and vengeance and everything else he knows how to deal with. Most of the clan fought like that, and well, you've seen the results. He reached across and grasped his younger self's arm. Not harshly, but because something told Indra the connection was important. You get to decide what the Uchiha techniques and traditions are now. You, not Itake. I know you'll come up with something impressive. Sasuke stared like Indra had hit him in the face. Naked shock as the boy's entire training structure and driving focus had the support beams carved asunder. Of course, Naruto spoiled the moment by wandering and singing something about ramen. Wrap it up and put it in a cup. Oh, morning. Indra sheepishly let go of Sasuke's arm and leaned back in his chair, suddenly aware of how empty his stomach was. Tea wouldn't cut it. Good morning, Naruto. You're right on time, I was just about to make scrambled eggs. If the Uzumaki noticed the awkward atmosphere in the room, he didn't comment on it. He always was selectively oblivious. Gee, thanks Indra-san, but it's no trouble. I'll just make myself some ramen. Indra rolled his remaining eye, but it didn't produce the same effect. You're having eggs. Besides, I intend to see how you both fare in the dojo before school. Sasuke's already so enthusiastic and I thought it would be an excellent way to start our day. As Naruto cheered and Sasuke's brain visibly started back up again, Indra allowed himself a small slice of satisfaction. Even if most of their conversations so far had been arguments, he'd always been at his best when teaching Sarada techniques and he saw no reason to stop the one part of his parenting that he knew would work well. And if it allowed him to train with his singular eye and kick the pants off two rambunctious preteens, well, that was all a bonus. Walking the children to school wasn't strictly necessary, but Indra was going all the way back to basics. He'd read plenty of parenting books before, when Sakura was pregnant and they'd both worried about being the best parents possible. Well, if Sarada had thought he'd failed at that, clearly, he needed to start from scratch. He listened to Naruto chatter about how he was going to be an intimidating Hokage with his Iron Club of Authority and Justice while Sasuke kept bringing up the Genjutsu lessons they both needed to work on with Sakura. It was good the three of them were already getting along so well, and he saw it when Sakura joined their little group around Sejun Street. She'd been waiting for them and both boys greeted her warmly. Well, Sasuke nodded and said nothing else, but Indra remembered when his primary response to Sakura's existence had been annoyance and disdain. Their discussion of Genjutsu principles and translation for Naruto was one of equals. Sakura spoke with confidence and puffed her chest out slightly, something he could feel that she'd picked up from Ino Yamanaka, or perhaps from her inner self. He'd learned about that psychological quirk during Genjutsu marriage counseling and inner Sakura had belted him across the face hard enough to leave a psychostigmatic bruise that lasted for 2 weeks. He rubbed his cheek at the memory and tuned back in to see the three children looking up at him with questioning eyes. Sorry, I was thinking. What did I miss? Naruto spoke up, of course. Sakura-chan wanted to know what the coolest Genjutsu you'd ever seen was. Indra relayed to them the story of a mist ninja who'd once used a technique that shifted every object 6 degrees to the right, then the left, in alternating, sinusoidal patterns that made dodging Kunao difficult even for the Sharingan. Indra had been so impressed by the technique he'd actually delayed breaking out of it to test its effects. By the time he'd finished the story, the group had arrived at the gates of the academy and he waved them off with a small smile on his face. Visible displays of affection and positive reinforcement are key to developing strong familial bonds. He was going to succeed at parenting if he had to rewrite his entire personality from the ground up, Sage Demet. He felt the signatures of the two Umbu who'd been following them move off to the school as well and started in surprise as someone tapped him on the shoulder. Inoichi Yamanaka and his daughter stood behind him, both with the satisfied smiles of two ninja who'd managed to show up a teammate. Indra blinked and offered his hand to Inoichi, who shook it and introduced his daughter. They exchanged meaningless pleasantries as Indra tried to shove down the memory of Ino, foaming at the mouth as the memories of something boiled her brain inside her skull. It would not happen. He would not allow it. His conscious mind registered a faint, "See you dad, Mr. Uchiha," and a small blonde figure dashing to catch up with Sakura and the main object of her affection. Inoichi jerked his head to indicate a direction and Indra fell into step alongside the tall man with automatic steps. "I'm guessing you caught only one word in 5 of that conversation," said Inoichi and Indra nodded apologetically. "Despite a month of bed rest, I've still got some work to do up here." He tapped his temple and Inoichi made a noise of agreement. "I could recommend someone, if you'd like. Not a Yamanaka, but he's an excellent conversationalist." Indra weighed the pros and cons of therapy until a light went off in his brain. "Actually, Yamanaka-san, I'd rather pick your brain, when you have the time. Strictly in a personal capacity, he added as the man began to look wary. If I'm going to be living with an Uzumaki and an Uchiha as teenagers, some advice from another ninja parent would be nice. Things were already changing. Sasuke Uchiha would have never asked for help from another man and wouldn't be caught dead using the word nice in conversation. But this wasn't about his pride, this was about making sure Naruto and Sasuke were safe. About making sure they didn't make his mistakes all over again. And if Inoichi fit the criteria of ninja parent, who also knew what made Indra tick, well, even better. The blonde grinned at him as they moved through the edge of the residential district towards the foot of the Hokage mountain. An Uchiha asking for help with a personal matter? This is a nice change. Why me? Indra outlined the thoughts he'd been turning over in his head all morning, about the need to deal with several missions out of the village, with long-time horizons, while also being a parental figure. Even with shadow clones, he couldn't split the difference in a way he would have liked. Inoichi tucked his hands into his massive jacket's pockets. Don't really know what to tell you, since you said your wife's gone. Mayasta helps run our flower shop, and I took AT&I posting within the village until our daughter graduates. When she's running missions of her own with a Jounin sensei, we won't need to be around quite as much. Have you thought about a babysitter? I'd suggest a family friend, but Deshki grimaced and Indra nodded in understanding. Can you imagine Uzumaki with a babysitter? He and Sasuke would drive them crazy within the week and they'd be bored on top of it. The Deshki paused, unsure of how much Inoichi knew, but the Jonin waved him on. I'm essentially your case officer, so I'm filled in. You were saying. Well, that was a relief. The have been helpful, but now I've proven sane and capable-ish. They'll be heading back to their posts this week, I suspect. A shame, Kakashi seems to really like them. They reached the foot of the mountain and Inoichi sent a pulse of chakra into the stone, which shimmered in recognition. The Yamanaka led Indra through the wall and into the headquarters, but the conversation continued as they passed by other black-coated specialists or mask-clad agents. Indra wondered how many of them were rude. Well, you'll be surprised to know Kakashi's tapping out from so he'll have more free time for your brats. Nobody expected it, but Sarutobi's been smug all morning. This would be why you brought me to your secret base, then. Well, this and your upcoming mission concerning Orochimaru. Plenty of people want to take a crack at that bastard, especially with those maps you gave us. Danzo wants to speak with us about squads, but I'm there strictly in an advisory capacity. He grinned at Indra as they passed a mess hall with scattered squads filing in for miga soup and rice balls. And to keep you two from killing each other, of course. Indra allowed himself an Uchiha smile in response. A wise decision. Shimura Danzo's office within the base was refreshingly mundane. When Indra had last been there, it had been empty, with any important papers or jars of sherry non-ice long gone. Now, there was a large desk, a wall of filing cabinets with explosive seals taped all over them, and an irate old man signing forms. Danzo sat in the only chair and ignored them for several minutes as he worked his way through whatever he was pretending to work on, but Indra was an old hand at this game. Bureaucrats across the continent loved making you wait. It reinforced whatever small scrap of procedural power they had and let them set the terms of the conversation. Indra just examined the office. No family photos, he'd expected that. A pitted, scarred, slightly rusting leaf headband lay at the corner of the desk, next to the lamp that illuminated it in the otherwise dim room. Two masked, hooded agents, Monkey again, and Crayfish stood as still as statues in the corners, next to a bookshelf. Indra turned on his sherry non and cocked his head to examine the titles. Lightning's Foreign Policy since 40 Me by Hook and Spinner, Obvious Pseudonyms, What the Mizukage Wants by L.R. Why Clans Fail by Asimoglu and Robinson, and Classic Cage Speeches in a well-worn hardback next to Letters of the Century. Interesting. Your devotion to the children is unexpected, given how little time you've spent with them, commented Danzo without warning. The mission you have proposed, despite your bounty of intelligence on the Sound Village, will require the highest focus and commitment. He moved a small stack of papers to the side and Crayfish walked them out the door to some unknown destination. You will fall in combat against Orochimaru of the Sun, and if you are thinking of the well-being of some children miles away. It was impressive how quickly the Umbu leader managed to irritate Indra, but he reined himself in. This time, he would not allow Danzo to occupy the moral high ground. I assure the counselor my focus on Orochimaru will be absolute and undivided. Furthermore, I would remind you that an Umbu cordon will not matter, no matter if they are 2 or 7 masks deep, if some agents are more concerned with capturing intelligence than ensuring enemy nin do not escape. Danzo sent him an accusatory look, to which Indra brandished his stump. You never did ask about what I said when we first met. Or does Sarutobi not know you've been bartering a new arm from Orochimaru? Danzo's lips thinned into a tight line and he pulled his own bandaged arm from its sling with his free hand. Though it terminated below the elbow unlike Indra's, the arm did not move on its own and flopped in his grasp like a deboned fish. I would think a fellow invalid would appreciate the development of viable shinobi prosthetics, no matter the source. Besides, the correspondence had allowed us to track down one of his laboratories in T country despite the number of false trails he laid. It was a viable intelligence method. Still consorting with an enemy of the village, said Indra shortly. If it's a prosthetic you desire, I know an excellent sculptor in Ashina province with a wide variety of dash. Inoichi cut in with a few documents he fished out from the inner lining of his coat. The personnel reports, Counselor. Indra and Danzo glared at each other for a moment, brandishing their appendages in a silently absurd challenge, and Inoichi sighed as he stepped between them. The cordon will, as you suggested, consist of 60 shinobi for each hideout, of which 15 will be sensors staggered along the second line to sense any stragglers. They are on pages 1 through 4. Indra took a few deep breaths through his nose and lowered his stump to examine the list. No names immediately jumped out at him as obvious root agents, and he compared the list to the ones I had shown him 3 decades before. Even with the Sharingan's perfect recollection, the root agents could be operating under different names within Umbu. They could have different names every month or every assignment, all known and tracked only by those within Danzo's circle of trust. There was a reason that despite the third Hokage's fury, Root had been so hard to uproot from Umbu ranks. He spoke up. Hyuga Jonin could help fill the gaps around the northern hideout. I know one of the prisoners there might prove difficult to capture without disabling his chakra points entirely. As Danzo and Inoichi nodded their assent and continued discussing which hideouts were best defended or most vulnerable, Indra sent a silent apology to a young Yugo and to whichever unlucky Hyuga first encountered him. They spent the rest of the morning and most of the afternoon going over the Umbu roster necessary and parsing the plans for moving that many ninja through to the land of rice paddies without detection. Or, at least, detection as late in the game as possible. Every missing nin they captured was another possible olive branch to get the other great nations to cooperate against the Akatsuki. Indra lobbied hard to include Mise Hitari Anko, knowing Orochimaru's ex-student had just as much a desire to see the snake suffer as he did, if not more. Inoichi hedged and Danzo had been convinced she could not be trusted on such a delicate operation. But it's not a delicate operation, is it? Indra was arguing. We're systematically capturing a small hidden village of roughly 300 enemy ninja and an unknown number of captive prisoners. We get the last group freed, the odds will be much more even. You propose increasing the number of combatants by a factor of 3, each with their own agendas and many with possible grudges against the Leaf, said the leader of the Umbu. Even with confidence in my Umbu's skills, your proposal will invite disaster and chaos. Chaos Orochimaru and other critical members could use to slip away. Your arguments return to the central question of this mission, said Inoichi. Is it focused on the destruction of dangerous enemies, or the liberation of prisoners? Will it be a warning to the Leaf's enemies, or a politically motivated mission to gain goodwill and bargaining chips for the war to come? We all know, the first option is easier for the other nations to understand. Indra forced himself to think before responding. His Naruto's charisma and concern for others would have allowed them to focus on the latter, and likely would have made it more successful. No one could calm a panicking ninja captive like Naruto Uzumaki's Ninshu, but Indra was here instead, so they had to work with what they had. He knew his Naruto would be disappointed in him. Your point is well made, Inoichi-san. We shall leave the prisoners where they are until the fighting is finished, then release them. However, I do believe Specialist Anko's expertise with traps would be useful for our assault on the main southern compound. Otherwise, we'd be forced to move at speed through tunnels I know are keyed to genetic markers and will blow if the right guards don't reset the seals for the next shift. You mentioned that in Report 12, murmured Danzo absently as he went over the rough floor plan Indra had provided. No doubt some of those tunnels hadn't been dug yet, and perhaps Orochimaru hadn't invented the tricky ceiling defense, but it never hurt to be prepared. They all looked up at a knock on the door and Danzo did something complicated beneath his desk that released several seals. Enter. A masked Umbu agent entered with a small scroll, still covered in dust and sweat. They'd been running hard and had recovered their breath only once they were safely behind the village walls. Indra empathized, even if they did stink. Fresh intelligence from Iwakagir, sir. Danzo dismissed the agent with a wave of his hand and broke the scroll seal with a drop of his own blood. As he read, his expression sharpened beyond its usual steely gaze and he threw the report across to Indra. Deodara of the Hidden Stone was declared a missing nin last week when he stole the devouring Deva parasite for his personal use as an explosives expert. So that's what those things were called. Indra was silent as he read the report, but Danzo continued, presumably for Inoichi's benefit. Stone Hunter Nin failed to capture him, but some bounty hunter got lucky and delivered his corpse to the Great Stone Arch on Saturday. Report says she shattered every rib he had and ripped out the parasite's teeth just to be safe. Sounds like your report was accurate, but that eye of yours may have overestimated his prowess. Shattered every rib he had. Indra scanned the report twice over, but there was no further mention of the bounty hunter. It sounded like Sakura, certainly her monstrous strength, but there wasn't enough to be sure. And divorce or not, Indra wasn't going to give Danzo a heads up that his ex-wife may have been alive and was likely heading in the direction of Konohagakure. He gave silent thanks to his habitually blank poker face, rolled up the scroll, and passed it to Inoichi. It wasn't Sakura for sure. There were other ex-ninja or even samurai with chakra-enhanced strength. He had a mission to plan for, one he couldn't afford to let personal failings get in the way of. Indra kept lying to himself for the rest of the day, then the rest of the week, but there was no further news. No obliterated towns, no decrease in western bounties. He sighed. It was probably nothing. Still, for the next few weeks he kept an eye and ear on the pink-haired girl as she trained with Katsan or walked to school. No strange dreams mentioned, no exhaustion, no sudden increase in confidence or chakra control. No mysterious comments. Just a girl learning how to be a ninja and discovering that the dreamy Sasuke Uchiha could still be a bit of a brat. Indra felt a knot of tension in his back loosen, just a smidge. Chapter 25, The Calm Before the Storm. Summer was over and the Leaf Village was well into autumn when the Umbu and the Hokage were satisfied with the plans. Indra had worked his way through 3 parenting books, had gone to Inoichi for advice 4 times, and felt reasonably confident his departure would not cause Naruto and Sasuke to abandon the village in pursuit of him or Itachi. He was not being paranoid, he was speaking from experience. In this, especially, Kakashi was a gift from the gods themselves, as was Kat. Officially, the Fox Squad was disbanded, and its members rotated back into active duty roles, but a purple-haired Umbu just kept finding time to return to a small back garden and tutor 2 small, increasingly ferocious children on blade work and what genjutsu she knew. She might disappear without warning for days, weeks, at one point, a month and a half, but Indra was able to offer pointers and fill in enough that both Sasuke's Crescent Moon training and Sakura's genjutsu at least did not regress while their teacher was gone. Naruto had Kakashi's undivided attention, for the most part, and Indra once privately admitted to Inoichi over drinks that the gray-haired Jonin had in fact become the perfect babysitter and teacher Indra knew his strange little family needed. Once everyone had teamed up to teach Naruto about food groups other than ramen, sometimes at leafy green Kunao Point, the boy ate what seemed like half the refrigerator on a regular basis. Indra was grateful he was drawing a specialist Jonin's salary and found lifting massive grocery bags an adequate workout while an orange-clad child clambered over his shoulders and a dark blue one followed in his wake, arguing all the while. He knew Danzo still disapproved, but the head of the Umbu was also too busy running his Black Ops within Black Ops to prepare the land of rice paddies for their mission. Then hideous disaster struck twice, in quick succession. First, the Land of Grass announced it was closing its borders to all Konoha shinobi until the Land of Fire paid restitution for the large tax shipment its shinobi had failed to protect from unidentified ninja in black robes and red clouds. Secondly, Sakura's parents had invited Indra over for dinner. In comparison, the second even might seem pitifully small compared to the massive reorganization of material and mission briefs required in Konoha, some of which put Indra's Operation Harmony into a further state of chaos. However, the idea of dinner and a friendly interrogation ran up against the rocks of Indra's basic personality and stayed beached. Sure, he could use the mind alteration jutsu to create a more relaxed, outgoing personality, but Mrs. Harano had a tendency to chat in the marketplace, and people would notice discrepancies, and then there would be more questions, and on and on. He brought up the topic one afternoon during training when he'd been pushing Sakura in and out of genjutsu to break her of the normal disorientation such a shift caused. At the same time, Naruto and Sasuke were attacking him with all their might with their preferred styles and even with wooden weapons. Indra was finding it difficult to block all of their attacks. Sometimes 3 limbs just wasn't enough. Predictably, none of them stopped attacking for even an instant, even though Sakura frowned in confusion and Sasuke rolled his eyes. "So Sakura's mom wants to meet you, why should we care?" asked his younger self as he went for Indra's legs. Sakura groaned in exasperation. Boys were so stupid. Because if Uchiha-san just sits there silently or puts his foot in his mouth or something, it reflects badly on us as well. Not that I would do that. She gave the older man a flat look of deep suspicion. The first time we met you nearly vomited on us and ended up a sobbing wreck within an hour and I had to drag your nephew off for fried chicken. If you piss off my mother, I can't save you. She covered her mouth the instant the crass remark escaped her lips, but none of the others commented on it. Naruto was giving her bad habits, for sure. But if no one reprimanded her, were they really bad habits? Indra shrugged, heedless of the girl's internal dilemma. The last time he'd officially met Mabuki Harano, it was after he'd been an infamous missing nin, then a war hero, then gotten her daughter pregnant in the wilderness of Fire Country. He'd deserved every single one of those broken ribs and the 2-hour rant that had followed. Things couldn't be worse than that. I await my doom with dignity, then. So what are your parents like, asked Naruto, bringing a wooden staff down in a 2-handed chop that Indra interrupted by kicking him back across the dojo. Having one parent with a famous history and another he refused to acknowledge, the boy was curious about comparisons. Sakura broke out of another genjutsu and plunged back into another one, but she still replied in a distant, distracted voice. Well, they argue about a lot of dumb stuff, but it's not really arguing, I guess. It's just how they talk sometimes and they smile when they do it. Indra spared a moment to reminisce about the Uzumaki Uchiha household. He and Naruto had bantered like that even into their old age. A good memory. My mom's kind of strict, so she makes most of the decisions because dad's a pushover. For someone who's a desk chunin now, he's pretty easygoing. She broke through the vision of mud pools Indra had given her and she pumped her fist in satisfaction. Jokes a lot, but they're all terrible, so I'm warning you now. At least we'll have that in common. For once, that got the 3 children to back off and give him odd looks. Sakura looked curious, Sasuke suspicious, and Naruto looked like a cat that had made off with a bowl of cream. You do dad jokes? I haven't heard you make a joke the entire time I've known you. Their sparring partner spun his own wooden sword into a resting position. Joking with Kaizushi Harano had been deeply awkward at first, but when the man had discovered Indra's sense of humor was simply more subtle, it had been the start of a long-standing tradition of making Sarada want to develop Kamui simply to escape their family events. On second thought, perhaps that was another tradition it would be best to not revisit. It might not be a good first impression, on second thought. Sasuke looked thankful but Naruto groaned and started chanting. Kmin, jokes. 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 Indra shared a long-suffering look with the others but it had been his fault for bringing it up in the first place. Fine. What's the worst thing about eating a clock? Indigestion? Losing hands? Indra shook his head. It's time-consuming. Now all 3 children had wooden weapons and set upon him with all the fury of the deeply wronged. That Friday evening, Sakura had wandered over to the waiting Indra in front of the schoolyard and handed him written directions to her house, then left to await the Uchiha Uzumaki delegation there. Indra was grateful for the extra thought and insisted they all return to the Uchiha district to change into something nice. Naruto had complained, but both Uchiha insisted that this was about helping Sakura, so her parents knew she was spending her time with reasonable people. Naruto had his delinquent reputation and Indra was still something of an object of mystery to the civilian populace, which was why he still garnered so many stares at the grocery store. Presumably they already knew about Sasuke Uchiha in great detail. At that, Naruto relented and turned up in the only collared shirt he owned, which was of course, orange. Sasuke had opted for a slightly more open Uchiha garb, with a lower collar that exposed his entire face and neck, as well as a pair of jeans and a belt that made him vaguely formal. Indra stuck his head into his younger self's room to find the boy glaring at his shoes in frustration. The boy spoke without preamble. "Which shoes are better? If I use the formal black ones, they'll get dusty by the time we get there and it'll look bad. Our sandals just seem so normal." Indra indicated the dress shoes as he shrugged into a blue hakama jacket over a purple-tinted kimono. "It's not that dusty, they'll be fine." He paused as a thought occurred to him. "Are you actually worried about this?" Sasuke shuffled his sandals back into the closet and moved to a chair as Indra entered the room in full, appearing fully relaxed. "You're the one who bought a fitted kimono and jacket for this, you tell me. And you've been twitchy all day. You've seen me twice today. You were at school. And both times, you were twitchy. This wasn't worth arguing about. If they don't like me, that's fine. If they decide we're being a bad influence on Sakura, then we might have trouble. How could we be a bad influence?" Indra thought about the 4 cracked ribs and the 2-hour tirade from a lifetime ago. Adults often have their own strange ideas of what a bad influence is. "Now let's go. On the way I'll tell you about the time I was run out of a stone town because I forgot to put a shirt on." The delegation stood in front of the perfectly normal-looking, 2-story beige townhouse. Naruto and Sasuke swallowed simultaneously while Indra was wishing he'd added a second layer of deodorant. He knew by the end of this, he was going to be sweating like a pig. Lying to the Hokage and the head of the Umbu was one thing. That was professional. Lying to his ex-mother-in-law who was meeting him for the first time? That was personal. Indra sent a silent prayer to his parents and the goddess Amaterasu for her protection and rang the doorbell. The house shook on its foundations as something massive barreled towards the door and was stopped in its tracks. They could hear Sakura's voice even through the door. "No, Mom, please let me dash." The door opened and a man with a starburst-shaped hairstyle and purple hair smiled at them. Welcome, Uchiha-san. Thank you all for coming. Please come in, I have some refreshments if you're ready for them before dinner." Sasuke made a strangled moan from behind his lips and Naruto had stuffed a fist into his mouth to stop himself from laughing. Indra bowed politely. "Your hospitality is appreciated, Harano-san. Thank you for having us." At Kaizashi's ushering, they stepped inside and removed their shoes, but the man kept giving Naruto odd glances. Understandable with the fist in his mouth. "Is he, all right?" Kaizashi asked uncertainly. All of Sakura's rants about Uzumaki this and idiot Naruto that, perhaps the boy was slow-minded. Of all people, Sasuke came to his rescue. "No sir," said the boy, "he's just hungry all the time. Your daughter helped us with some research actually and she found Uzumaki tend to eat far more than most people, for some reason." The look on his face was something between a smirk and a smile, but it passed beneath Kaizashi's notice. "He'd eat us out of the Uchiha district if we weren't careful." Naruto opened his mouth to retaliate with something loud and cutting, but the older man's laughter interrupted him as it boomed throughout the small entryway. "I see, well he's in luck tonight. My wonderful wife had a shrimp dish she was eager to use on some unsuspecting Gunniya pigs, so eat your fill." He leaned down and spoke in a conspiratorial whisper. "I could never stand the faces myself. Food shouldn't look back at you before you eat it." Indra realized they were loitering and moved further into the hallway, indicating with his stump for Naruto and Sasuke to find and reinforce Sakura, wherever she was. His minions nodded and stampeded around the corner, where they heard exclamations of surprise from Sakura and her mother, as well as what handsome young men they were. That idea wasn't going to survive the night, Indra would put money on it. Kaizashi reached an arm around his guest's shoulder and guided him into a small but cozy living room, with a window looking back out onto the darkened street. He gestured and Indra sat down as his host poured 2 small cups of tea. For me it was just a routine mission in some small village in rain. Dove to catch a kid falling off a tower and blew both of them out. Hospital said I can still walk, but I won't be leaping through trees anymore. You. Indra held his stump up, which was mostly hidden under the jacket. I was about to do something deeply stupid and my friend tried to stop me. Blame my arm off with my own jutsu, so it's mostly self-inflicted. He allowed himself to dip back into memories of the final valley, indulging in what was now a perversely fond memory. The cartographers had indeed been forced to redraw the map and the Land of Fire's tourism board had sent sternly worded letters about the destruction of a national monument. Kaizashi looked taken aback, but Indra waved the memory away in a mollifying gesture. It was in the past, and I've adopted. The challenge helped keep my mind clear. If you handed me a new arm tomorrow, I wouldn't know what to do with it. Sakura's father had the same smile she did, sudden and blinding in its sincerity. Well, it's good to hear someone is capable of appreciating my jokes. We tolerate your jokes, dear. Mabuki Harano's white dress circled around the small couch Indra had been on, wiping her hands on a towel and swooped in to kiss her husband's cheek. Though I hope Uchiha-san doesn't plan on adding more of them this evening. She gave him an appraising look as Indra rose to his feet and bowed. I would not dream of it, if the lady of the house wishes otherwise. Well now, the lady of the house, for such a ruffian you have refined manners. How refreshingly unexpected. She sat down as well, crossing her legs and Indra followed suit, sipping once again at his tea. What have I missed so far, while I was convincing the Uzumaki boy to not eat directly from the skillet? Clever. Somehow Indra had already acquired a reputation as a ruffian, and she'd posed a question so he couldn't refute the accusation without seeming rude. The social battlefield Mothers of Konoha occupied was as wide and dangerous as any site from the Fourth Shinobi War, and after the third PTA meeting, Indra had the etiquette protocols drilled into him by his wife. Umbu Hansine was easier by far, but he rallied immediately. We were discussing old wounds and the difficulties they can cause, but if such conversation is too crass for polite company, you are welcome to ask away. If Indra couldn't directly inquire about his reputation, he could at least attempt to outpolite her, without seeming standoffish. But Mabuki surprised him. Oh, on the contrary, please continue. My husband complains about his knees whenever it rains, but I'm fairly certain he just says that to avoid the dishes. Some perspective would be welcome. Kaizashi chuckled and put an arm around his wife's shoulders in an affectionate squeeze. You know, standing that long is difficult, that's why I'm parked behind a nice safe desk instead of up in one of those guard towers. Well, I'm sorry to say my arm doesn't trouble me much, so there are no good stories to tell there. This can itch like nothing else, though, Indra said, tapping his hand on his bandage-covered left cheek. Never for long, and never at any particular moment, it's the strangest thing and very difficult to not scratch. Sakura's mother leaned forward, face alight with ghoulish fascination sometimes common with civilians and shinobi injuries. Oh, how terrible. But surely there is some comfort when you change the bandages? It's been several months now, after all, and Lord Hokage did announce you were going to be a shinobi anyway. What prompted that? The bandages were self-sterilizing, some sealing jutsu the hospital wrote on the inside. A curious invention. But I volunteered to return to active duty despite my injuries because, he paused, this was edging into heavier territory than perhaps appropriate for a civilian dinner party, but she had asked the question. Sooner or later, he needed to ask one and put Mabuki on the defensive. Well, I've been traveling all my life in one way or another, but it wouldn't feel right, leaving Suzuki without a proper mentor. Has Sakura mentioned her genjutsu aptitude, by any chance? For someone still in the academy, she has exceptional chakra control. While her husband grinned and began extolling how his own small chakra pool had made him efficient in his jutsu usage, pride and regret warred across Mabuki Harano's face, even though she tried to hide it behind a fake laugh and a hand. Well, Sakura-chan was so insistent we sign her up for classes. I must admit the most I thought she'd be interested in were the academic tests. I'm glad to see she's enjoying herself, though I trust you're not pushing her too hard? What sort of genjutsu are you showing her? Not 2 days prior Indra had locked Sakura's mind within a maze of 112 weak genjutsu and challenged her to see how quickly she could break out. Her normal resolve had begun to sputter in the middle, around the 67th, but her inner self had rallied and proceeded to punch through 8 layers with each swing of her fists, blasting a straight line to the maze exit. She'd emerged soaked in sweat and gasping for breath, but ecstatic at her progress and Indra's words that her hard work was paying off. Children who receive encouragement are more likely to believe their skills can improve, while children who are simply praised believe their skills are fixed, thus and try to avoid challenging those expectations. A subtle, but important distinction parenting book number 3 had taught. Well, I've kept the exercises suitable for a girl of her age, of course, said Indra, warming to his subject. No genjutsu that simulate pain, mostly environmental focuses for now. Muddy swamps, endless grasslands, snow, that sort of thing. Inoichi Yamanaki has been quite helpful with suggestions. Oh, the Yamanakas are such good people, aren't they? Both parents were pleased and he spoke with them for a while about how kind the blondes were, and how from what he'd seen, Ino was one of Sakura's good friends. In the meantime, he kept his ears open, wondering where Sakura had dragged the boys off to. With Naruto in the house, it was suspiciously quiet. Apologizing to his hosts, he flicked on his Sharingan and looked around, then nodded when he saw 3 blue glows above them on the 2nd floor. Forgive me, but I wanted to make sure my charges haven't wandered into trouble. With Naruto, it's always a distinct possibility and I'm a paranoid old man. Mabuki smiled and nodded in a way that said she knew exactly how Naruto could be like that, doubtless from one of Sakura's stories while her husband guffawed. Nonsense, you're not an old man, you're only in your late 20s. I realize it must now seem like drudgery for a wandering young man, but raising children really isn't that bad. See, I'm raising a child and I don't have a single gray hair yet. At that, Indra gave a real, but small smile for the first time. Harano-san, as it turns out, with these kids, I haven't been this happy in a long while. In fact, he said honestly, I'm looking forward to it. They're good kids and they're going to become great ninja. Mabuki's face was doing that pride/regret dance again, so she muttered something about checking on dinner and swooped out of the room. Indra looked across the coffee table at her husband and raised his only eyebrow in a silent question. He was reasonably sure Kaizushi would provide some sort of context, but the man looked just as embarrassed as he felt. Indra felt like he had to take some responsibility, even if only to mollify the couple as much as he could. If it was something I said, I do apologize. It's only partially to do with you, Uchiha-san, admitted his host. Your abrupt arrival was the talk of the house for a few days and when your nephew he is your nephew, correct? Indra inclined his head and finished off his tea the way some ninja finished shots. Toss it back, gulp it down. Well, when your nephew approached her about a research project, she was over the moon about it. When we heard she was spending time with the Uzumaki Ragamuffin, well, we worried a bit, given his reputation and his, well, condition. His guest breathed out slowly through his nostrils and checked once again. No one within hearing range. You mean the Ninetales? Ah, so you do know. Given you've practically adopted the boy, we weren't sure what to think, so dash. I had nothing to do with that, admitted Indra, pleased he could shift the target on his back and only a little guilty about who it was on now. That was entirely my nephew's idea. He positively insisted Naruto move in with us and I didn't have the heart to tell him no. And Sasuke has been a steadfast supporter of his friend just as Naruto has stood by him. That the Ninetales is sealed inside him, matters not one iota. As I said, they're good kids Harano-san. I don't doubt that dash. All evidence to the contrary. Even he winced at the words that had escaped from his mouth and Kaizushi looked equally taken aback. All right, damage control. My apologies, that was rude of me. Still, Harano-san, if this dinner was to get to know me, use it to get to know Naruto as well. You'll find he will surprise you, I think. He's just a boy. Now the man looked slightly guilty and leaned closer. Don't you worry, training with them. That he might be dangerous. Indra remembered sharp teeth and a boiling cloak of chakra feasting on nightmares. Oh yes, the Ninetales was dangerous, but Naruto. He remembered Naruto jumping up and down as he created 7 shadow clones in the backyard, and Sakura giving him a friendly punch in the shoulder at his success. He remembered his Naruto, his husband, sitting next to him as one of their blonde children took the wide-brimmed hat of the Hokage and placed it upon the raven-haired head of the other. He, Naruto, and Sakura had all smiled and cried their way through the ceremony. Even if it had ended up being more of a joint effort raising their children in the end, shared happiness simply grew bigger. He gathered his thoughts and spoke. Every ninja is dangerous, Harano-san. It's our job to be dangerous. I am likely one of the most dangerous people you will ever meet in your life, and yet, I am sitting here with a teacup and looking forward to our dinner. Naruto is only ever dangerous when fools or madmen harm his friends, one of whom is of course, your daughter. Even if she breaks his heart, he couldn't bring himself to harm a hair on her head, it's just not in his nature. I don't know if I can make it any clearer than that. Is that sufficient? The purple-haired man was silent for a while as a buzzer sounded from within the kitchen and Mabuki's head appeared in the doorway. We're ready, dear, if you could grab the children. His wife's voice appeared to pull the normally talkative man from within his own head and he grinned again. Of course, my wonderful autumn evening. They both rose, and Kaizashi offered his hand to Indra, then remembered the missing limb and swapped hands with a slight grimace. You've given me a great deal to think about, Indra Uchiha. Now, go follow my wife, you must be starving, and I'll find out where your nephew and my daughter have disappeared to. The black-haired Uchiha nodded. Of course. Compared to that, the rest of the evening was as easy as a genin obstacle course. The shrimp turned out to be delicious and Kaizashi periodically would discreetly transfer a few of his own shrimp to the blonde boy sitting across from him whenever his wife's attention was elsewhere. Of course, this won him Naruto's eternal appreciation and what would have been a beaming smile until Sakura kicked him under the table, missed, hit Indra's shin, and landed the blow the second time, as she admonished Naruto for not swallowing his food. Sasuke performed as expected, polite but terse when adults addressed him until Naruto and Sakura needled him enough that genuine conversation began to flow. Well, it was a conversation just a shade away from an argument, but Indra was sure his prayers earlier in the evening had been answered. As it turned out, the ninja in training had become engrossed with Sakura's hair ribbon collection as Naruto had insisted they experiment with where they would eventually place their own Konoha headbands. Despite some blushing from Sakura and initial refusals from Sasuke, they'd all ended up warming to the project by the time Kaizashi Harano summoned them for dinner. Sakura had been blushing because both Naruto and Sasuke had agreed that her forehead was not in fact abnormally big and a headband there would look perfectly normal. Sakura's mother had poured him a glass of sake without asking and Indra soon fell into a conversation with her about one memorable time when an old sand monk named Shikaka had gotten tipsy when he'd been invited to the reception of a wedding, and the amusing anecdotes he'd told in turn. What had actually happened during Tamari's wedding was that Shikaka the One-Tail had shown up at their evening reception to steal every drop of booze supposedly to spite Gaara and had then gotten horribly drunk with him. Indra was reasonably sure the name of the sand spirit wasn't widely known even among shinobi, so a detail like this should be safe to use. There was a moment of fear when he'd slipped up and mentioned my husband but the woman hadn't even blinked and urged him to continue the story, slightly flushed herself. If Amaterasu was still listening, he hoped Sakura's mother wouldn't remember that detail come morning. All in all, it had been a good evening. Sakura and her father saw them off and soon the two Uchiha and the Uzumaki were walking back home in an easy silence. For once even Naruto had talked enough. The fact that 2 days from now he would be setting out to take down a small ninja village bothered him not at all. After all, compared to curious parents, Orochimaru was refreshingly straightforward. Less family dynamics, for once. Check the description for the links to the author.